Hand over the ranch, they demanded. The quiet woman smiled. Men like you have tried before. "20 armed men, one woman, a desert spring worth killing for." When Mara Kincaid refused to surrender her land in the blistering summer of 1889, powerful men sent enforcers with guns and legal papers. They thought her silence meant weakness. They thought her isolation meant vulnerability. They were catastrophically wrong. What happened next became the story that changed the frontier forever. A battle so brutal, so unexpected, that it made empires reconsider their greed. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The heat that summer didn't just oppress, it punished. Across the southwestern desert territories, the sun hammered down with relentless fury, turning the earth into cracked pottery and the air into something you had to fight to breathe. Cattle died standing up. Waterholes that had sustained life for generations evaporated into chalky memories. Desperate men made desperate choices, and the strong took from the weak without ceremony or conscience. But on a remote patch of hardscrabble land 60 miles from the nearest settlement, one spring still flowed clear and cold, defying every law of that merciless season. And the woman who owned it had already buried one husband who'd tried to protect it. Mara Kincaid stood on the weathered porch of her ranch house in the dying light of late August, watching dust clouds gather on the eastern horizon. She was 34 years old but looked older, sun-hardened, lean, with hands that bore the calluses of someone who'd learned early that no one was coming to save you. Her dark hair, shot through with premature silver, was pulled back severe and practical. Her dress was faded calico, mended in a dozen places, functional rather than pretty. But her eyes, smoke gray and unsettling, those eyes had witnessed things that would have broken softer souls. She'd been watching those dust clouds for the better part of an hour, tracking their approach with the patience of someone who'd hunted game across these flats since childhood. The riders weren't hurrying. They didn't need to. They had numbers, legal backing, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Behind her, the ranch house door creaked open. "They're coming with a lot more men this time, Mara." Calder Boone stepped onto the porch, moving with the stiff gait of a man whose body had accumulated 6 decades worth of hard use. He'd been foreman of the Kincaid Ranch since before Mara was born, had taught her to shoot, to track, to read the land like scripture. His weathered face, mapped with deep lines, showed concern, but not fear. Calder Boone had lived through range wars, Indian campaigns, and the lawless years before the territories pretended at civilization. He'd seen bad men before. "How many?" Mara's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "I count 12 riders, maybe more in the dust. They're riding formation, military style." Calder pulled a tobacco pouch from his vest pocket, started rolling a cigarette with fingers that trembled slightly. Not from fear, from age. They sent lawyers last time, then surveyors with sheriff's deputies. Now this. Now they're done asking. Mara folded her arms across her chest, still watching the approaching dust. The Garrison Development Syndicate doesn't make 4th offers. 5th, if you count that insulting letter 3 weeks back. A ghost of a smile touched Mara's lips. "I'm not counting letters. Words are cheap when you've got lawyers writing them by the pound." The dust clouds were closer now. She could make out individual riders, dark shapes that solidified against the orange haze of approaching sunset. They rode with purpose, with the kind of coordinated movement that spoke of men who'd worked together before, who knew violence as a profession rather than a passion. "You could still take their money," Calder said quietly, not looking at her. "It's a lot of money, Mara. Enough to start over somewhere else. Somewhere with actual law, actual civilization." "Is that what you want? Civilization?" She glanced at him sidelong. "After everything?" Calder finished rolling his cigarette, struck a match against the porch rail. The small flame illuminated his face for a moment, showed all the hard years, all the choices that couldn't be undone. "What I want stopped mattering about the same time I got too old to enforce it. I'm just saying you've got options here. You don't have to make this stand." "Yes," Mara said softly, "I do." Because they killed her husband for this spring 2 years ago. Made it look like an accident, a fall from a spooked horse in rough country. But Mara knew. The bruises on James's body told a different story than the one the coroner wrote down. The convenient timing, right after he'd refused the syndicate's first offer, told its own truth. And when you knew the truth, you had two choices: swallow it and live small, or stand your ground and make them pay the full price for their greed. Mara Kincaid had never been good at living small. The riders were close enough now that she could hear them: the steady thunder of hooves, the jangle of tack and weaponry, the low voices of men who thought they were riding toward an easy conclusion to a stubborn problem. "Get Josiah and Ramon," Mara said, turning back toward the house. "Tell them to bring the rifles. Not the working guns, the killing guns." Calder drew deep on his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "You sure about this path, girl? Once we make this choice, there's no walking it back." Mara paused in the doorway, looking back at the approaching riders. The sun was setting behind them now, turning them into silhouettes crowned with fire, dark harbingers riding out of apocalyptic light. "They already made the choice," she said. "2 years ago, when they put James in the ground, I'm just answering the question they asked." She stepped inside, and Calder heard her footsteps moving through the house with quick, decisive purpose. A woman who'd already counted the cost and found it acceptable. He finished his cigarette, crushed it under his boot heel, and went to find the others. The spring that made the Kincaid Ranch worth killing for wasn't much to look at, just a rocky outcropping 200 yards behind the main house where clear water bubbled up from some deep aquifer, flowing steady year-round into a natural basin before trickling off into a shallow creek that sustained 30 acres of reasonable grazing. But in that summer of 1889, when drought gripped the territories like a choking fist, that spring was liquid gold. The Garrison Development Syndicate had bought up surrounding lands for pennies on the dollar as desperate ranchers sold out or lost their spreads to foreclosure. They had plans, ambitious plans involving irrigation, land subdivision, the kind of large-scale agricultural development that required steady water and lots of it. The Kincaid Spring was the keystone to the entire operation. Without it, their investment was questionable. With it, they could transform 30,000 acres of scrubland into profitable farmsteads, could sell parcels to settlers desperate for opportunity, could build the kind of empire that turned territory investors into territorial powers. All that stood between them and that future was one widow who didn't understand how business worked. Or so they thought. Inside the ranch house, Mara moved through rooms that held the accumulated life of 2 generations. Her grandfather had built this place in 1861, one of the first white settlers crazy enough to try making a life this far from civilization. He'd chosen the location specifically for the spring, had understood that water was the only currency that mattered in desert country. He'd built solid, thick adobe walls, small windows positioned for defense rather than light, heavy timber framing that had weathered decades of wind and weather. The house had never been attacked, but it had been built by a man who knew attack was always possible. Mara was grateful for his paranoia now. She went to the locked cabinet in what had been James's study, withdrew the key from around her neck. Inside were weapons that had nothing to do with ranch work. 2 Winchester 73 rifles, pristine and oiled, a Colt Peacemaker revolver with custom grips, boxes of ammunition stored careful and dry, a shotgun with the barrel shortened to a legal length, and something wrapped in oilcloth that she didn't touch. Not yet. She loaded both rifles, checked the action on each one, filled a canvas satchel with ammunition. Her movements were practiced, efficient, muscle memory from a childhood spent learning survival from men who'd survived the unsurvivable. "Mara?" She turned. Ramon Garcia stood in the doorway, his young face tight with worry. He was barely 20, had come to work the ranch 3 years ago when his own family's spread failed. Good with horses, better with cattle, and loyal to the point of foolishness, which was why Mara had tried to send him away when the trouble first started. He'd refused to go. "They're here," Ramon said. "Maybe 15 of them. Calder says they're forming up at the property line, not advancing yet. They want us to see them, want us to understand what's coming." Mara handed him one of the loaded rifles. "You remember what I taught you about shooting men instead of game?" Ramon swallowed hard but took the rifle. "Aim for center mass. Don't hesitate. Don't warn. Don't wound if you can kill." "Good." She picked up the second rifle, the ammunition bag. "Where's Josiah?" "Checking the perimeter. He thinks they might try to circle around, come at the spring from the back ridge. Mara nodded. Josiah Trent was the newest hand, had drifted in looking for work last spring. He was older than Ramon, harder, with the kind of past he didn't talk about, and scars that suggested violence was familiar territory. She'd hired him because good help was scarce, kept him on because he worked hard and didn't ask questions. Now she was glad for whatever dark experience had put those scars on him. Tell him to hold that position. They'll try for the spring once they realize we're not surrendering. She moved past Ramon into the main room. How's Calder? Loading his old Sharps buffalo rifle. Says if he's going to die, he wants to do it with a gun that's killed more living things than most diseases. Despite everything, Mara smiled. That sounded like Calder, gallows humor from a man who'd attended enough funerals to find death more familiar than frightening. They moved through the house together, Ramon young and nervous, Mara silent and certain. She'd known this day was coming, had known it since the morning she found James's body, since the moment she looked into the sheriff's eyes and saw the truth he was paid to ignore. The powerful took what they wanted in this territory, always had. The law was something rich men purchased along with their land and influence, just another resource to be deployed when convenient. But law was a two-edged blade, and sometimes the powerless learned to cut back. Outside, the sun had fully set, leaving behind that brief purple twilight peculiar to desert country. The riders had formed a loose semicircle about 100 yards from the ranch house, visible in the gathering dark, making no effort at concealment. They wanted to be seen, wanted their numbers to sink in, wanted fear to do the work before violence became necessary. Mara stepped onto the porch, the Winchester held casual but ready. Calder was already there, his big Sharps rifle propped against the rail within easy reach. Ramon took position at the far end of the porch, trying to look confident and mostly succeeding. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just two groups of people watching each other across scrubland and gathering darkness, the weight of inevitable violence hanging in the air like smoke. Then one of the riders spurred forward, big man on a big horse, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through size and intimidation. He stopped about 50 feet from the porch, hands visible and empty, playing at courtesy. "Mrs. Kincaid." His voice was deep, professionally pleasant. "My name is Tate Brennan. I represent the Garrison Development Syndicate in matters requiring personal attention." "I know who you are, Mr. Brennan." Mara's voice carried clear in the still air. "Your reputation arrives before you, usually accompanied by fires and unfortunate accidents." If the insult landed, Brennan didn't show it. He just smiled, cold expression that never reached his eyes. "The syndicate sent me to make one final offer, one last opportunity for this to end peacefully, with everyone walking away satisfied. Then they wasted your time and their money. I'm not selling." "Mrs. Kincaid," "It's still Mrs. Kincaid because my husband is dead, Mr. Brennan. Dead in circumstances your employers find convenient and I find suspicious. So when you talk about peaceful endings and satisfaction, understand that my satisfaction would involve watching every one of you hang from a tree." The pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, and Brennan's true face showed through, hard, cruel, impatient with obstacles. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. The law is on our side. We have proper claims filed with the territory. The sheriff has reviewed our documentation and found it sound. You're the one in the wrong here, Mrs. Kincaid. You're the one defying legitimate authority." "Legitimate?" Mara tasted the word like poison. "Is that what you call papers signed by judges your bosses purchased? Is that what you call law enforced by men on your payroll?" "The law is the law, regardless of your cynical interpretation." Brennan straightened in his saddle. "The syndicate is prepared to offer you $15,000 for this property and all water rights. That's more than generous for a spread this size in this condition. Take the money, Mrs. Kincaid. Start over somewhere else. Live comfortable." "On blood money? On the price they put on my husband's life?" She shook her head slowly. "I'd rather starve." "That can be arranged too." The threat hung naked now, all pretense of courtesy abandoned. Behind Brennan, the other riders shifted, subtle movements, hands drifting toward weapons, horses sensing the tension and dancing nervously. "The syndicate owns everything around you now," Brennan continued. Every neighbor who might have helped has either sold out or been foreclosed on. You're alone here, Mrs. Kincaid, completely isolated. And isolation makes people vulnerable to all sorts of unfortunate occurrences. Like the kind of unfortunate occurrence that killed my husband? Accidents happen in dangerous country. Horses spook, men fall. The desert doesn't distinguish between the deserving and the unfortunate. Brennan's smile returned, colder than before. Take the money. Sign the papers. Walk away with your life and enough cash to live comfortable somewhere that appreciates civilization over stubborn pride. Mara was quiet for a long moment, just looking at him, looking past him at disarmed men waiting in the darkness, at the guns and the horses and the casual certainty of violence they all carried like familiar tools. Then she smiled, small expression, barely visible in the fading light, but sharp as broken glass. Men like you have tried before, Mr. Brennan. Excuse me? To take what isn't yours, to use violence and legal manipulation to steal from those you think are weak. Men like you have tried before. She shifted the rifle slightly, just enough to make its presence clear. They're buried in that desert you just warned me about, the one that doesn't distinguish between the deserving and the unfortunate. Brennan's face hardened. That sounds like a threat, Mrs. Kincaid. No, Mr. Brennan, a threat is what you rode here to deliver. What I'm giving you is a promise. She took one step forward, letting the porch light catch her face, her eyes. You and your men turn around right now, ride back to whatever hole spawned you, and tell the Garrison Syndicate that Mara Kincaid is not selling. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. This land is mine, bought with my family's blood and my husband's life. And anyone who tries to take it will pay in the same currency. Bold words from a woman alone. I'm not alone. Mara gestured slightly toward Calder, toward Ramon visible on the porch. I've got men who know what they're dying for. Can you say the same about your hired guns? How much is the syndicate paying them? Enough to take a bullet for corporate profit? More than enough. But Brennan's confidence had fractured slightly. He wasn't used to resistance like this, to prey that refused to understand its powerlessness. Then test it. Ride forward. Try to take what you came for. Mara's voice dropped lower, harder. But understand that the first man who crosses onto my property dies. The second dies. The third dies. And I'll keep killing until you run out of men willing to die for someone else's greed. The silence that followed was absolute. Behind Brennan, horses shifted nervously. One of the hired guns, younger man, less experienced, actually looked away, suddenly fascinated by the horizon. Even Brennan himself seemed momentarily uncertain, as if he'd expected sheep and found wolves instead. You're serious, he said finally. Not a question, a realization. Absolutely. The syndicate won't tolerate this defiance. They'll bring legal action. They'll bring the sheriff. They'll bring federal marshals if necessary. Let them bring whoever they want. Let them bring armies. This land is mine, and I will defend it with every breath in my body and every bullet I can afford. Mara raised the Winchester slightly, not quite aiming, but definitely not friendly anymore. Now get off my property, Mr. Brennan, and tell your employers that the next time they send men to threaten me, those men should be prepared to die. For a long moment, Brennan just stared at her, trying to reconcile the quiet woman in faded calico with the steel-edged promise he'd just heard, trying to calculate odds, consequences, the kind of trouble this might cause versus the satisfaction of breaking her here and now. Finally, he pulled his horse around. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Mrs. Kincaid. No, Mara said softly. The biggest mistake was theirs when they killed my husband and thought I'd be too weak or too frightened to make them pay for it. Brennan spurred his horse, riding back toward his men. There was brief consultation, low voices, gestures toward the house, hands on weapons. For a moment, Mara thought they might attack right then. Consequences be damned. But Brennan raised his hand, said something sharp, and the riders wheeled their horses and rode off into the darkness. Not fleeing, but withdrawing with discipline and coordination. Professional violence postponed, not abandoned. Mara watched them go until the sound of hooves faded completely into the vast desert silence. Only then did she lower the Winchester. Only then did she allow herself to breathe properly. Well, Calder said from behind her, his voice rough with released tension. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Probably both. Mara turned back toward the house, suddenly exhausted. They'll be back. I know. With more men, more guns, they'll stop pretending at legality and just take what they want. I know that too. Mara looked at her foreman, this man who'd known her since childhood, who'd taught her everything about survival in hard country, who was choosing to stand with her even though every practical instinct probably screamed at him to run. You should leave, Calder. You and Ramon and Josiah. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. Calder straightened despite his aching back, despite his 60 years. Your grandfather hired me when I had nothing. Your father trusted me with this place. Your husband died trying to protect it. You think I'm going to cut and run now, right before the real fight starts? The real fight might get you killed. Girl, I'm 63 years old. I've survived things that should have killed me a dozen times over. If I'm going to cash out, might as well be for something that matters. He grinned, rare expression that transformed his weathered face. Besides, I'm curious to see if you're as good as your grandfather always claimed you'd be. Despite everything, the danger, the exhaustion, the weight of coming violence, Mara smiled. Let's find out together. They spent the night preparing. Josiah came in from the back ridge with a report that the syndicate men had made camp about 2 miles east. Visible fires, no attempt at concealment, clear message that they weren't leaving. They're settling in, Josiah said, checking his rifle with the practiced ease of someone who'd done violence before. Making a statement, showing us they've got time and patience and no intention of backing off. How many? Mara was checking the house's defensive positions, making sure every window had a clear field of fire. Every door was reinforced. I counted 18 around the fires. Could be more in the dark, keeping watch. 18. Calder looked up from where he was sorting ammunition. Against 4 of us. Not exactly favorable odds. Odds aren't everything, Josiah said. They're hired guns, working for pay. We're defending our home, different kind of motivation entirely. A motivation doesn't stop bullets. No, but it makes you smarter about where you stand when the bullets start flying. Mara appreciated Josiah's calm pragmatism. Whatever his past had been, and she'd learned enough to know it was violent, he wasn't afraid of what was coming. Wasn't pretending this would be easy or that they'd definitely survive. Just accepting reality and preparing accordingly. We've got advantages, Mara said, spreading a hand-drawn map of the property on the table. We know this land. We know the approaches. We know where the good cover is, where the killing zones are, where they'll expect resistance, and where we can surprise them. And they've got numbers, professional experience, and unlimited ammunition. Calder joined her at the table. Plus legal backing if things go wrong. If we kill any of them, we're the ones who'll hang. Only if we lose. Mara traced the property lines on the map. If we win, we write the story. Self-defense against armed trespassers. Protection of property rights. The same legal fiction they're using, just deployed in our favor. Ramon had been quiet through most of this, cleaning his rifle with nervous energy. Now he spoke up, voice tight. What if they don't attack? What if they just wait us out? They've got supplies, reinforcements available. We don't. They'll attack, Josiah said with quiet certainty. Men like that don't have patience. They're used to overwhelming force-solving problems quickly. They'll give us maybe 24 hours to reconsider, then they'll come hard and fast, expecting to crush resistance in the first push. Then we need to make that first push cost them more than they're willing to pay. Mara looked around the table at her 3 defenders, old man, damaged veteran, frightened boy. Not exactly an army, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in motivation. They weren't fighting for money or because someone told them to. They were fighting because this was home, and home was worth dying for. I want firing positions established at each corner of the house, Mara said, shifting into command mode. Calder, you take the north window with your sharps. Longest range, best field of fire toward the main approach. Josiah, southeast corner, covering the spring and back ridge. Ramon, southwest, watching the blind side. I'll be mobile, filling gaps and directing fire. What about the spring itself? Josiah asked. If they're smart, they'll try to take it first. Cut off our water, force surrender through thirst rather than assault. The spring's exposed, Mara admitted. We can't defend it directly without spreading ourselves too thin. but we can make approaching it costly. I want rifle pits dug between here and the water, concealed positions where we can put down fire on anyone trying to reach it." "When?" Ramon asked. "They're watching us right now. If we start digging, they'll see it." "Then we dig in darkness. Now. While they think we're just scared people waiting for dawn." Mara rolled up the map. "Josiah, take Ramon. I want 3 positions dug between here and the spring, deep enough to provide cover, concealed enough that they won't spot them until it's too late. Use the existing rocks and brush for camouflage. And if they attack while we're outside digging, then we fight from wherever we are, but they won't attack tonight. Brennan's too professional for that. He'll wait for proper light, proper coordination. Tonight's for intimidation, tomorrow's for violence." She spoke with more confidence than she felt, but leadership required certainty even when doubt whispered its warnings. Her grandfather had taught her that men would follow strength, even false strength, more readily than they'd follow honest fear. "Get moving. I want those positions ready before dawn." Josiah and Ramon gathered shovels and moved out into the darkness, shapes disappearing into the vast desert silence. Mara watched them go, then turned to Calder. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" The old foreman took his time answering, lighting another cigarette, staring out into the darkness where hostile campfires burned like distant stars. "I think you're your grandfather's granddaughter," he said finally. "Same stubbornness, same refusal to bend, same absolute conviction that being right matters more than being safe. That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I've got." Calder looked at her, his weathered face serious. "Your grandfather chose to settle here when everyone said this land was too hard, too remote, too dangerous. Your father chose to stay when the Indian troubles started, when smarter men fled. Your husband chose to resist the syndicate when accepting money would have been easier. And they're all dead. And this land is still in your hands." Calder smiled slightly. "Maybe that's crazy. Maybe it's something better than sanity. I don't know anymore. I just know that some things are worth dying for, and a man, or woman, who doesn't have something worth dying for probably isn't worth much in the first place." Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Gratitude mixed with sorrow, love mixed with the terrible knowledge that this old man was choosing death over compromise on her behalf. "Thank you, Calder." "Nothing to thank me for. I'm just finishing what I started 60 years ago when your grandfather hired me. Protecting Kincaid land from bastards who think power is the same thing as right." He picked up his Sharps rifle, ran a hand along its worn stock. "This old girl has put down buffalo, elk, hostile warriors, and more than a few men who needed putting down. Seems fitting she gets one more fight before we both retire permanent." "Don't talk like that." "Why not? Death's coming for all of us eventually. At least this way I get to choose the terms." He moved toward his assigned position. "You get some rest, Mara. Tomorrow's going to be the longest day of your life." But Mara knew she wouldn't sleep. Instead, she spent the dark hours checking weapons, reinforcing defensive positions, writing letters she hoped wouldn't need to be found and sent, writing to distant relatives, to a lawyer in the territorial capital, to anyone who might care that Mara Kincaid died defending what was hers, rather than surrendering to corruption and greed. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of digging, Josiah and Ramon preparing the rifle pits that might make the difference between survival and slaughter. Could see the hostile campfires burning steady in the distance. Could imagine the men around those fires counting their money, checking their weapons, sleeping easy in the confidence of overwhelming force. They thought tomorrow would be simple. They thought one widow and 3 defenders would break at the first assault, would surrender or die quickly, would make this easy. Mara Kincaid was going to teach them the cost of thinking. She pulled the oilcloth bundle from the gun cabinet, the one she hadn't touched earlier, unwrapped it slowly, revealing the weapon her grandfather had carried during the territory's bloodiest years. A Colt Walker revolver, massive and brutal, designed not for accuracy but for stopping power, designed to put men down and keep them down, to deliver violence so overwhelming that enemies didn't get back up. It was old, outdated by modern standards, but it was the gun that had defended this land when defense meant savagery, when survival required more than law or civilization could provide. Mara loaded it carefully, set it on the table where she could reach it quickly. Because tomorrow, civilization was going to fail again. and savagery would be all that stood between her and destruction. Outside, the desert wind picked up, dry and cold, carrying the scent of distant campfire smoke and the whispered promises of coming violence. The stars burned overhead, indifferent and eternal, witnessing another small human conflict in a land that had seen generations of blood and struggle. Mara stood on her porch one last time before dawn, looking out at her land, at the spring that flowed eternal, at the grazing land her family had died to protect, at the house her grandfather had built to last. "I won't let them have it," she whispered to the darkness, to the ghosts, to whatever force had sustained her family through decades of hardship, whatever it costs, whatever I have to do. This land stays Kincaid land. The wind was her only answer, constant, indifferent, eternal. But in the distant darkness, hostile campfires burned, and tomorrow's reckoning was already gathering its strength. Dawn came reluctantly, as if the sun itself hesitated to witness what the day would bring. Mara stood at the north window, watching pink light bleed across the eastern horizon, illuminating the hostile camp 2 miles distant. She'd been awake all night, not from fear, but from the kind of heightened awareness that came before violence, when every sense sharpened and sleep became impossible. Behind her, Calder was already in position with his Sharps rifle, the barrel resting on a sandbag they'd positioned during the dark hours. His breathing was steady, controlled, the rhythm of a man who'd done this before and knew the value of conserving energy. "They're moving," he said quietly. Mara raised the field glasses her grandfather had carried during the territorial conflicts. Through the lenses, she could see men breaking camp with practiced efficiency, rolling bedrolls, saddling horses, checking weapons. No rush, no panic, just professional preparation for professional violence. "Count?" she asked. 22 that I can see. 3 more than last night. They brought reinforcements during darkness. 22 armed men against 4 defenders. The mathematics of slaughter. Josiah and Ramon are in the rifle pits? Been there since an hour before dawn. I saw Ramon's position. Good work. You can't see it unless you know exactly where to look. Calder shifted slightly, keeping the Sharps trained on the distant camp. That boy's got more steel in him than he knows. He's about to find out how much. Mara lowered the glasses, rubbed her eyes. The exhaustion was there, waiting beneath the adrenaline, but she couldn't afford to acknowledge it yet. They'll come at us in waves. Test our defenses first, probe for weakness, then commit everything once they think they've found our breaking point. Assuming we have a breaking point. Everyone has a breaking point, Calder. The trick is making them reach theirs first. From somewhere in the house, she heard a board creak, footsteps moving through rooms that had held 3 generations of her family, rooms that might become a tomb before this day ended. She thought about her mother, who died giving birth to a stillborn son when Mara was 12. Thought about her father, killed by pneumonia during the brutal winter of '75. Thought about James, whose body they'd found broken at the base of a cliff the syndicate's surveyors had been examining the week before. All of them buried in the small plot behind the house, all of them part of the land now in ways that went deeper than ownership or legal documents. "If we die here today," Mara said quietly, "make sure they bury me with my family. Not in some town cemetery, here, where I belong." Calder was silent for a moment. "You're not going to die here, Mara. You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise that if you do die, you won't die alone." He glanced back at her, his weathered face serious. "And I can promise that every son of a bitch who comes for this land will pay more than they ever thought possible. That's something, at least." It was something. Maybe not comfort, but certainty had its own value when everything else was uncertain. The distant figures were mounted now, forming into organized groups. Even at this distance, Mara could see the military precision of their movements. These weren't random thugs or desperate men looking for quick money. These were professionals experienced in the kind of frontier violence that never made it into official records. "Here they come," Calder said unnecessarily. The riders moved out in 2 groups, main force of perhaps 15 men heading directly toward the ranch house along the established road, while a smaller group of 7 split off, angling toward the back ridge where the spring bubbled up from the earth. Smart tactics. Divide the defense. Force difficult choices about where to concentrate limited firepower. Mara moved quickly through the house, checking each position. At the southeast window, she found the field of fire Josiah would need when the riders approached the spring. At the southwest corner, she verified Ramon's sightlines from his concealed rifle pit. Everything was as ready as 4 people could make it. She returned to Calder's position, bringing extra ammunition, a canteen of water, strips of cloth that could serve as bandages if needed. Main group's riding casual, Calder observed, tracking them through his rifle's sights. They're not expecting resistance. Still think we'll fold when we see how many of them there are. Let them think it. Confidence makes men careless. Mara settled beside him, her own Winchester ready. Don't fire until I give the word. I want them close enough that every shot counts. How close? Close enough to see their faces. Close enough that they'll remember ours when they're dying. The words should have sounded harsh, cruel even, but Mara spoke them with the flat certainty of someone who'd already made peace with the violence to come, who'd counted the moral cost and found it acceptable against the alternative. The syndicate had started this, had murdered her husband, corrupted the law, used their wealth and power to crush anyone who stood against their expansion. They'd made the choice to turn business into bloodshed. Now they'd learned that blood flowed both ways. The main group was close enough now that individual faces were becoming visible. Tate Brennan rode at the front, his big frame unmistakable even at 300 yards. Behind him, hired guns in various states of readiness. Some alert and professional, others slouching in their saddles with the boredom of men who thought this job would be easy money. 200 yards, Calder murmured, his finger resting light on the trigger. 150. 100. Mara waited, watched. Let them come. At 75 yards, Brennan raised his hand and the group halted. He sat there for a moment, studying the ranch house, clearly expecting Mara to emerge with white flag or pleading words, some acknowledgement of defeat. Instead, silence, just desert wind and waiting. Mrs. Kincaid, Brennan's voice carried across the distance. We're coming onto your property now. This is your final opportunity to accept the syndicate's offer and avoid bloodshed. Mara said nothing, just watched through her rifle's sights as Brennan's confidence began to crack into irritation. I have legal documents authorizing seizure of this property, he continued, pulling papers from his saddlebag and holding them high like they meant something. I have sheriff's deputies in my company with arrest warrants for your obstruction of legal proceedings. Surrender now and you'll be treated fairly under territorial law. Lying bastard, Calder muttered. I don't see any deputies, just guns for hire. The law is whatever he says it is, Mara replied, until we make him admit otherwise. Brennan waited another moment, then gestured to 2 of his men. They spurred forward, riding toward the house with hands ostentatiously away from their weapons, theatrical display of peaceful intention that fooled no one. 50 yards. 40. 30. Mara, Calder said softly. Warning, not question. Wait. 20 yards. Close enough now to see their faces clearly, younger men, nervous despite their bravado, glancing at each other as if wondering who'd volunteered them for this particular duty. 15 yards. Mara stood up in the window, Winchester rising to her shoulder in one smooth motion. Stop right there. Both riders hauled back on their reins, horses dancing nervously at the sudden command. Behind them, the main group tensed, hands dropping to weapons, bodies shifting into combat readiness. Mrs. Kincaid, one of the riders said, his voice trying for confidence and landing somewhere near anxiety. We're just here to pull. I know why you're here. I'm telling you to leave. All of you, right now, while you still can. Can't do that, ma'am. We've got our orders. Then you've got a choice to make. Mara's voice carried cold and clear across the morning air. You can follow those orders and die on my land. Or you can ride away and live to collect pay on an easier job. What's it going to be? The 2 riders exchanged glances. She could see the calculation happening, weighing the money against the very real possibility that this quiet woman meant exactly what she said. Ma'am, there's 22 of us and 4 of us. I know, I can count. But here's what you're not counting. You're on my land now, my territory. Every approach is covered. Every killing zone is mapped. And the 4 people you're threatening would rather die than surrender. She shifted the Winchester slightly, just enough to make its targeting clear. So ask yourself, Is whatever the syndicate's paying you worth being the first one to die? Because that's what happens next. The moment you reach for your weapon, the moment you advance one more step, I kill you. Then I kill your friend. Then I start on the men behind you. Silence. Absolute and terrible. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. You're bluffing, the second rider said, but his voice shook. Try me. For a long moment, no one moved. Two groups of people frozen in the mathematics of violence, calculating odds and consequences and the value of their own lives against someone else's profit. Then, from behind the riders, Brennan's voice cracked like a whip. Enough theater! Take the house! Everything happened at once. The two forward riders spurred their horses, hands dropping toward weapons. Behind them, the main group surged forward in a coordinated rush, spreading out to present multiple targets, professional tactics executed with practiced precision. Mara shot the first rider in the chest. Single crack of rifle fire that echoed across the desert morning. The man jerked backward, tumbled from his saddle, hit the ground, and didn't move. Beside her, Calder's sharps boomed like thunder, and the second rider's head simply ceased to exist above the jawline, his body continuing forward for 2 steps before his horse realized its rider was dead and veered away screaming. Here they come! Calder was already reloading with the speed of long practice. Mara worked her Winchester's lever action, firing into the advancing mass of riders. She saw a man clutch his shoulder and spin away, saw another's horse go down in a tangle of legs and screaming, saw Brennan himself duck low over his horse's neck as a bullet cracked past his head. From outside, toward the spring, she heard different gunfire, the sharper crack of Josiah's rifle, the lighter report of Ramon's carbine. The second group had reached the rifle pits, found defenders where they'd expected clear approach. The element of surprise, that brief advantage, was already spent. Now came the real fight. Bullets began hammering into the ranch house. Heavy slugs that punched through adobe, shattered window frames, filled the air with dust and splinters. Mara dropped below the window line, crawled to a different position, came up firing from an unexpected angle. This was the pattern her grandfather had taught her during those long childhood summers when he'd told stories of the territorial conflicts, when he'd explained that defense wasn't about standing your ground stupidly, but about making attackers pay for every inch, about being where they didn't expect, shooting from angles they hadn't planned for. Moving! She called to Calder and sprinted across the room in a low crouch, taking up position at the east window just as 3 riders swept around the side of the house, trying to flank their position. She caught them in profile, easier shots than head-on, fired 3 times in rapid succession. One rider fell, screaming and clutching his leg. Another spun away, maybe hit or maybe just spooked. The third actually got his pistol out, fired wildly at the window. And Calder's sharps thundered again, the massive bullet hitting the man's center mass with enough force to lift him clear out of his saddle. They're trying to circle, Calder shouted over the gunfire. Get to Ramon's side. Mara was already moving, reloading as she ran, muscle memory from thousands of practice sessions guiding her hands while her mind tracked threats and angles and the chaos of close-quarters combat. At the southwest window, she saw what Calder had spotted. 6 riders breaking away from the main assault, galloping wide to attack from the blind side where they thought the house would be undefended. But Ramon was in his rifle pit, concealed in rocks and brush, with clear sight lines to exactly this approach. The first rider never knew what hit him, just rode past Ramon's position and took a bullet through the ribs, fell hard and rolled, horse galloping away riderless. The other 5 realized their mistake too late. Ramon fired again, working his carbine's lever action with frantic speed, and another rider went down. The remaining 4 scattered, looking for cover, trying to locate the hidden shooter. Mara took the moment, settled her aim, led the nearest rider by 3 feet and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked, and the man tumbled sideways, crashed into the scrubland in an explosion of dust. 3 left of that group now, and they'd abandoned their assault, were just trying to find cover, to survive long enough to regroup. But the main fight was still raging at the front of the house. Through the gun smoke and dust, Mara could see Brennan rallying his men, organizing them into a proper assault formation instead of the wild rush that had failed so spectacularly. Calder, status. I'm good, down to 10 rounds for the sharps, but I've got the Winchester as backup. His voice was hoarse from gunsmoke but steady. I count 5 down, maybe 6 wounded. They're pulling back to reorganize. Which meant the first wave had failed. But it also meant Brennan now understood what he was facing, knew that the defenders were competent, prepared, willing to kill. The next assault would be smarter, more careful, more deadly. From the direction of the spring, gunfire had slackened but not stopped. Mara risked a glance out the window, saw Josiah emerging from his rifle pit, firing methodically at the group that had tried for the water source. Bodies dotted the ground between the house and the spring, at least 3 down, possibly more wounded, hiding behind rocks. "Josiah!" she called out the window. "Fall back to the house!" He heard, nodded, fired 2 more shots to discourage pursuit, then sprinted toward the ranch house in a zigzag run that spoke of military training. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet, but he made it to the porch, rolled behind cover just as a volley of gunfire tore through the space he'd occupied a second before. "They've got the spring," he said, breathing hard as he came through the door. 7 men up there now, dug in behind the rocks. I got 2 of them, wounded maybe 2 more, but they've got good cover. Let them have it for now. We'll worry about water later. Mara was reloading, counting her remaining ammunition. "How are you on rounds?" "Maybe 30 left? Been trying to make every shot count." "Good. We're going to need that discipline." She moved to the front window, staying low. "They're regrouping out there. Brennan's learning. Next time they come, it'll be coordinated. Suppressing fire from multiple angles, small teams advancing under cover, proper military tactics." "Can we hold against that?" Josiah asked. "We held against the first wave. We'll hold against the second." She said it with more confidence than she felt, but confidence was contagious. Men fought harder when they believed victory was possible. A voice carried across the battlefield, Brennan shouting from behind cover. "You've killed 5 men, Mrs. Kincaid. Wounded 3 more. That's murder under territorial law. Surrender now and you might avoid hanging." Mara almost laughed. Murder. As if the law had any meaning when men like Brennan wielded it like a weapon. "The only hanging today will be yours," she called back. "When the territorial marshal hears how you attacked a lawful property owner with armed force, when he learns about the murders your syndicate has already committed. Big talk from a woman trapped in her own house. Then come get me, Brennan. Storm this house. I've got plenty of bullets and all day to use them." Silence. Then movement. Riders pulling further back, taking up positions behind rocks and rises, establishing a perimeter that suggested siege rather than assault. "They're settling in," Calder observed, watching through a crack in the shutters. "Changing tactics. They'll try to starve us out now that the rush failed." "How long can we last without water?" Ramon had made it back to the house during the chaos, his young face smudged with dirt and gunpowder, eyes wide with the adrenaline crash that followed combat. 3 days in this heat, maybe 4 if we ration carefully." Mara pulled back from the window, took stock of her defenders. All alive. Some minor wounds. Ramon had a graze on his arm. Calder was bleeding from flying splinters. But everyone's still capable. They'd survived the first engagement, killed perhaps 7 attackers, wounded several more, broken the initial assault through firepower and determination and the willingness to kill without hesitation. But Brennan had 15 men still operational, still armed, still being paid to take this land by any means necessary. And now he knew that easy victory was impossible, which meant he'd commit to hard victory, siege, attrition, the patient violence of men who could afford to wait while their targets slowly died of thirst. "We need a new plan," Josiah said, voicing what they were all thinking. "They'll bring more men, more ammunition. They'll surround this house and wait for biology to do what bullets couldn't. Then we don't wait." Mara moved to the table, spread out her hand-drawn map again. "Tonight, after dark, we break their siege." 4 against 15? In darkness? That's suicide. "No, it's asymmetric warfare. It's using our advantages against their numbers." She traced the terrain features on the map. "They're thinking siege. They're thinking patient tactics. They're not expecting us to attack them." Calder came over, studied the map with the interest of someone who'd fought in enough conflicts to respect audacious strategy. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we pick off their sentries, create chaos, make them afraid of the darkness instead of confident in their numbers." Mara looked up at her 3 defenders. "They came here expecting sheep. Every hour we survive, every man we kill, we undermine that expectation. We make them question whether the pay is worth the price." "Mercenaries break when the job gets too expensive," Josiah agreed slowly. I've seen it happen. Men who'll fight for money won't necessarily die for it. Exactly. We just need to raise the cost high enough that profit becomes impossible. Mara straightened. First, we survive today. They'll probe our defenses, test for weakness, maybe try another assault at sunset. We hold. We conserve ammunition. We make every shot count. And tonight? Ramon asked. Tonight we hunt. The word hung in the air, predatory and definitive. They were no longer just defending. They were going on the offensive, turning the siege around, making the hunters into prey. From outside, gunfire erupted again. Not a full assault, just harassing fire designed to keep them pinned down, to waste their ammunition in response, to wear down their nerves through constant threat. Mara ignored it, let the bullets hammer uselessly into adobe walls that had withstood decades of weather and violence. Let Brennan waste his ammunition. Every round he fired was one less that could kill them when it mattered. Get some rest, she told her men. Eat if you can. We'll need our strength when darkness comes. They dispersed to their positions, settling into the patient endurance that defense required. Outside, the sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, baking the trapped men on both sides of this conflict. But Mara Kincaid wasn't trapped. She was exactly where she chose to be, on her land with her people, fighting for something that mattered more than survival. The syndicate thought they were besieging a desperate woman. They had no idea they had walked into the hunting ground of someone who'd learned violence from men who'd mastered it, who'd inherited not just land but the savage will to defend it at any cost. Night was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would reshape every calculation Tate Brennan had made about easy victories and acceptable losses. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of blood and gunpowder, carrying the whispered promise of escalation yet to come. In the distance, through the heat shimmer and gun smoke, Mara could see Brennan's forces digging in for siege, building firing positions, establishing perimeter, settling into the patient violence of men who thought time was their ally. She smiled grimly. They'd learn better when darkness fell. The afternoon sun hammered down without mercy, turning the ranch house into an oven that baked the defenders in their own sweat and determination. Mara moved between positions, checking on her men, rationing the last of their water into careful sips that barely wet parched throats. Outside, Brennan's forces maintained sporadic fire, not enough to be dangerous, just enough to keep nerves frayed and sleep impossible. Every 20 minutes, a volley of bullets would slam into the adobe walls, a reminder that the siege was ongoing, that surrender was still an option if they chose cowardice over conviction. Mara chose neither. She chose preparation. "Ramon," she called softly to where the young man crouched near the southwest window, his rifle barrel resting on a sandbag. "Come here. I need to show you something." He crossed to her position with the careful movements of someone who'd learned that exposed silhouettes drew bullets. His arm, wrapped with cloth from where the earlier graze had bled, showed rust-colored stains, but his hands were steady. "You did good this morning," Mara said, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Better than good. You held your position when most men would have run. Your grandfather would have been proud." Ramon's jaw tightened at the mention of his grandfather, the old rancher who'd lost everything to drought and debt, who'd died ashamed of his failure. "I didn't do it for pride, Mrs. Kincaid. I did it because running would have meant letting them win, letting them take everything, just like they took from my family. That anger, hold on to it. We're going to need it when darkness comes." She pulled him closer to the map still spread on the table. "Josiah and I are going out tonight. Calder's too old for this kind of work, and I need someone here who can coordinate defense if they attack while we're gone." "You're leaving me behind?" The disappointment in his voice was raw, immediate. "I'm trusting you with the most important job, keeping Calder alive and this house standing. If we fail out there, you two are the last line. You understand?" Ramon studied her face, looking for condescension or dismissal and finding only honest tactical assessment. Finally, he nodded. "What do I need to know?" Mara traced the perimeter she'd sketched on the map, showing where Brennan's men had established their siege positions. "They've got 4 sentries on rotation, here, 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 and here. 2-hour watches, changing at midnight and 2 in the morning based on what Josiah observed. Their main camp is here, about 400 yards northeast, where they've got good sight lines to the house during daylight but limited visibility at night. You're going after the sentries. First the sentries, then the camp itself if opportunity presents. Our goal is chaos. Make them afraid. Make them question whether sitting in the dark waiting for dawn is worth the money the syndicate's paying. She looked up at him. But if things go wrong, if you hear sustained gunfire that suggests we're pinned down or dead, you don't come after us. You hold this house. You make them pay for every inch. And if it comes to it, you make sure our deaths bought you enough time to survive until help arrives. What help? Everyone who could have helped already sold out or got foreclosed. Then you survive long enough to tell the story, to make sure people know what the Garrison Syndicate did here, how they murdered lawful property owners who wouldn't surrender to corruption. Mara's voice hardened. That's the last line of defense, Ramon. The truth. Sometimes the only victory left is making sure the bastards who killed you don't get to write the history. From across the room, Calder's voice carried low and urgent. Movement. Northeast position. Looks like they're trying something. Mara and Ramon moved to the window, peering through the narrow gap between shutter and frame. In the wavering heat, 3 riders were approaching from the direction of the spring. Not charging, just walking their horses forward with white cloth tied to a rifle barrel. Parley flag, Josiah observed from his position. They want to talk. Or they want to get close enough to assess our strength, Mara countered. Either way, we listen but we don't trust. The 3 riders stopped about 50 yards out, close enough for conversation, far enough that a sudden rush wouldn't reach the house before defenders could respond. Tate Brennan was the center rider, flanked by 2 of his hired guns, all of them showing the strain of a day spent under desert sun, with limited water and mounting casualties. Mrs. Kincaid, Brennan's voice carried across the distance. I'm requesting parley under flag of truce, no weapons, just conversation. Mara stepped onto the porch, Winchester held casual but ready, making no pretense of trust. Say what you came to say, Brennan, but don't waste my time with more legal theater. No theater, just honest assessment of your situation. Brennan pulled a canteen from his saddle, took a long drink, theatrical display meant to remind her of the water she no longer controlled. You've fought well, better than expected. You've cost us 7 dead, 4 wounded badly enough they're out of the fight. That's impressive for 4 defenders against professional soldiers. Is this the part where you offer terms? Where you pretend generosity while threatening destruction? This is the part where I point out reality, Mrs. Kincaid. You've held for 1 day. Maybe you can hold for 2, even 3 if you're lucky. But we control your water source. We have supplies and reinforcements available. You have, what, a few canteens, some stored food? How long before thirst makes you too weak to fight? How long before your men start questioning whether dying for your pride is really worth it? My men aren't dying for my pride, Mara called back. They're dying for the principle that land belongs to those who work it, not those who steal it through corruption and violence. Principles don't satisfy thirst. Principles don't stop bullets. Brennan's horse shifted beneath him, nervous from the tension. I'm authorized to make one final offer. $10,000, safe passage for you and your men, and we forget about the legal consequences of the men you've killed. You walk away alive and wealthy. We get the land and water rights we came for. Everyone survives. Except my husband. Except the other ranchers you've already destroyed. Except the next widow who stands in your way and gets crushed because I taught the syndicate that violence works. Mara shook her head. No deal, Brennan. This land stays mine or it becomes my grave. Those are the only 2 outcomes available. Then you're choosing death. I'm choosing to make you pay for it. And I'm betting that before I die, enough of your men will be dead or wounded that the syndicate will decide cheaper land exists elsewhere. She raised the Winchester slightly. Your parley time is over. Get off my property while you still can. For a moment, Brennan just stared at her. This woman, who should have been broken by now, who should have understood her powerlessness and surrendered to the inevitable. His frustration was visible even at 50 yards, the rage of a man who'd never encountered resistance he couldn't overwhelm. You're making a mistake that will haunt your final hours, he said, voice tight with controlled fury. My final hours are my own business. Yours might arrive sooner than you think. Mara lowered the rifle. Now leave before I decide parley flags are just another lie from men who've already murdered everyone else who trusted them. Brennan wheeled his horse around, the white flag forgotten in his anger, and galloped back toward his lines with his 2 escorts struggling to keep pace. Mara watched them go, calculating, planning, already mapping the routes she and Josiah would take when darkness finally came. Behind her, Calder emerged onto the porch. That was either very brave or very stupid. It was necessary. I needed to see his face, hear his voice, understand how close he is to breaking. Mara turned back toward the house. He's frustrated, angry, starting to question whether this contract is worth the casualties. A few more deaths, a few more wounds, and his hired guns will start deserting. Or they'll get mad enough to rush this house in force and damn the casualties. Then we kill them all and let the desert have their bodies. She said it flatly, without emotion, because emotion was a luxury defenders couldn't afford. Either way, tonight we changed the mathematics of this siege. The sun crawled toward the western horizon with agonizing slowness, each minute stretched by heat and tension and the knowledge that darkness would bring its own violence. Mara used the time to prepare, checking weapons, counting ammunition, explaining to Ramon and Calder exactly what they needed to do if the night raid failed. If we're not back by dawn, she told them, distributing the last of their rifle rounds. Assume we're dead. Hold the house as long as you can, but don't die stupid. If they breach the walls, if fire or overwhelming force makes defense impossible, you run. Get to the back canyon, hide in the caves my grandfather used during the territorial conflicts, survive long enough to reach Copper Valley, and tell the marshal what happened here. Nobody's running, Calder said firmly. We hold or we die. That's the deal we made when we chose this stand. The deal is that this land stays free of the syndicate's corruption. If that means you survive to fight another day, to testify against them in territorial court, then survival is the victory. Mara gripped the old man's shoulder. I need you to promise me, Calder, if it comes to it, if Ramon has to drag you out of here while you're cursing his name, you let him. You survive. You make sure the truth survives. Calder's jaw worked, emotions warring across his weathered face, pride, stubbornness, loyalty, and finally grudging acceptance. If it comes to that, but it won't. If it does, then I promise. But you come back, girl. You don't get to dump this mess in my lap and disappear into the night like some damn ghost. Mara almost smiled. Almost. I'll do my best. Josiah had been quiet through this exchange, cleaning his rifle with the methodical precision of someone preparing for close work. Now he looked up, his scarred face thoughtful. What's the primary objective tonight? Are we trying to kill Brennan specifically or just create maximum chaos? Chaos first. Assassination second. If opportunity presents to take out Brennan, we take it. But the main goal is breaking their confidence, making them afraid of the darkness, forcing them to pull in their perimeter and cluster together for safety. Mara joined him at the table where he'd disassembled his rifle for cleaning. Fear is a weapon just like bullets. We use both. I've done night work before, Josiah said quietly, not elaborating on when or where or under what circumstances. It's not like fighting in daylight. Everything's different. Sounds become magnified. Shadows trick the eye. Men shoot at ghosts and give away their positions. Then we become ghosts. We move quiet, strike fast, disappear before they can coordinate response. She watched his hands working over the rifle parts, confident, practiced, the movements of someone who'd done this exact maintenance hundreds of times in dozens of desperate situations. What did you do before you came here, Josiah? You've never said. He was quiet for a moment, reassembling the rifle with quick, efficient movements. Things I'm not proud of. Things that seemed necessary at the time. Military work that wasn't officially military, if you understand my meaning. I understand well enough. Mara had suspected as much. The way he moved, the way he assessed terrain, the calm acceptance of violence as a tool rather than a tragedy. And now? Now I'm trying to be something better than what I was. Trying to stand for something that actually matters, instead of just following orders from men who measured success in body counts and territory controlled. He looked up at her, his eyes direct. Your husband gave me that chance when he hired me. Didn't ask about my past, didn't demand explanations, just offered honest work and fair pay. I owe him for that. Owe you for keeping me on after he died. You've more than earned your keep. Not yet, but maybe after tonight, after we make these bastards pay for thinking they could take what isn't theirs, maybe then the scales will balance a bit. He finished reassembling the rifle, worked the action twice to verify function. What's our extraction plan if things go wrong? There isn't one. If we get pinned down, we fight until we're dead or they break. No surrender, no capture. The syndicate doesn't leave witnesses who could testify against them. Josiah nodded once, accepting the terms without complaint or false bravado. Then I guess we'd better not get pinned down. The sun finally touched the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows that would soon merge into complete darkness. Mara felt the familiar pre-combat tension building. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness that made every sense sharper, every detail more vivid. She'd felt this before, during the territorial conflicts when raiding parties came for settlements and survival meant fighting from childhood through nightmares into dawn. Her grandfather had taught her that fear was useful if you channeled it, deadly if you let it control you. She'd learned the lesson well. As darkness settled fully across the desert, Mara and Josiah prepared. They stripped off anything that might jingle or reflect light. No belt buckles, no metal buttons, no jewelry. They blackened their faces with ash from the stove, darkened their hands, became shadows among shadows. 2 hours past midnight, Mara said, checking the position of the stars through the window. That's when they'll be most exhausted, most complacent. The first sentries will be relieved, the new ones not yet fully alert. That's our window. Rules of engagement? Josiah asked, chambering around into his rifle. Silent kills on the sentries if possible. Knives before guns. Save ammunition for the camp raid. She picked up her grandfather's old Colt Walker, checked its massive loads. Once we're discovered, we go loud. Maximum violence, maximum chaos, then extract to different positions. We don't return to the house directly. Don't want to lead them back here if they pursue. Rendezvous point? The old wash a quarter-mile southwest. If we get separated, we meet there 1 hour before dawn. If one of us doesn't show, the other returns alone. She looked at him directly. No heroic rescues, no doubling back. If I go down, you save yourself and help Calder and Ramon hold the house. Clear? Clear. Same orders for you if I'm the one who falls. They shook hands. Brief contact that sealed the understanding. They were going into darkness together, but they might not both emerge. That was simply the cost of the choice they'd made. Be safe, Ramon said as they prepared to leave through the back door. Make them pay. We will, Mara promised. And you hold this house. Don't let anyone breach these walls while we're gone. They'd have to kill me first. Don't let it come to that. Then she and Josiah were moving, slipping out the back entrance into the cool desert night, becoming part of the landscape as generations of frontier survivors had learned to do. The stars overhead provided enough light to navigate by once their eyes adjusted, and Mara moved with the confidence of someone who'd explored every foot of this land since childhood. They circled wide, avoiding the direct line between house and camp, using every depression and rock outcropping for cover. Sound carried strange in desert stillness. The distant murmur of voices from Brennan's camp, the nervous shuffling of horses, the occasional cough or curse from men uncomfortable with night watch duty. The first sentry was positioned on a low rise overlooking the eastern approach. They could see his silhouette against the stars, could hear him humming quietly to himself, probably trying to stay awake in the numbing boredom of guard duty. Mara touched Josiah's arm, pointed. He nodded understanding. This one was hers. She moved like smoke, using shadows and careful placement of each foot to avoid loose rocks or dry brush. The sentry never heard her approach, never sensed the threat until her hand clamped over his mouth and her grandfather's old knife, the one that had survived Indian fights and range wars, slid between his ribs and found his heart. He struggled for perhaps 3 seconds, then went limp, dead weight in her arms that she lowered gently to avoid noise. She dragged the body behind rocks where it wouldn't be immediately visible, took his rifle and ammunition, and moved on. One down. She found Josiah at their rendezvous point 200 yards west. He held up 2 fingers. He'd taken out both the southern sentries while she'd been dealing with the eastern position. That left 1 sentry remaining, the one overlooking the northern approach. They moved together this time, coordinating their advance. The 4th sentry was more alert than his companions, constantly scanning his sector, rifle held ready. Professional behavior from someone who'd survived long enough to learn proper caution. He died anyway. Josiah's rifle cracked once, suppressed shot that sounded like nothing more than a branch breaking in the distance. The sentry dropped without sound, and they were moving again, ghosting toward the main camp, where perhaps a dozen men slept around dying campfires. This was the dangerous part. This was where silence became impossible, and survival depended on speed and violence and the willingness to kill without hesitation. Mara and Josiah separated, taking positions on opposite sides of the camp, creating crossfire zones that would maximize confusion. She could see sleeping forms wrapped in bedrolls, could hear snoring, could smell coffee and tobacco, and the accumulated stink of men who'd spent days in the field. She found Brennan's tent by its size and position, command tent separate from the others, showing the hierarchy even in siege conditions. Part of her wanted to put a bullet through it right now, to kill the architect of this violence while he slept defenseless. But that would alert the entire camp before the chaos could properly begin. Better to start with fire. She pulled the bottle of lamp oil she'd carried from the ranch house, soaked a rag, positioned it near the supply cache where saddles and ammunition were stored, struck a match, watched flame catch and spread. Then she opened fire. The Winchester cracked 5 times in rapid succession, aimed shots into sleeping forms that jerked and screamed and died without ever fully waking. Across the camp, Josiah's rifle joined the symphony, bullets tearing through bedrolls and canvas and flesh. Men erupted from sleep into nightmare, half-dressed, confused, scrambling for weapons while fire spread through their supplies, and bullets cracked from multiple directions. Someone was screaming. Someone else was praying. A horse broke free and galloped through the camp, adding to the chaos. Mara kept firing, working the Winchester's lever action with mechanical precision, choosing targets by firelight and muzzle flash. She saw a man raise his rifle toward her position and shot him through the throat. Saw another trying to organize defense and killed him before he could shout coherent orders. The supply cache exploded, ammunition cooking off in the fire, sending bullets zinging in random directions, forcing defenders to seek cover from their own supplies. Beautiful chaos that served Mara's purpose perfectly. She'd emptied the Winchester's magazine when return fire started finding her position, bullets cracking past her head, thudding into rocks she'd taken shelter behind. Time to move. She rolled right, came up running, sprinted 20 yards to new cover while reloading on the move. Behind her, the position she'd just abandoned was hammered by concentrated fire from men who'd finally oriented on her muzzle flash. But Josiah was raking that group from his position, his rifle firing methodically, and men were falling or diving for cover, and the whole camp was descending into beautiful, terrible disorder. Brennan emerged from his tent, pistol in hand, bellowing orders that were only partially heard over gunfire and screaming. "Form up! Establish perimeter! They're just 2 shooters. Find them and kill them." Mara shot at him, missed as he dove behind a wagon. She cursed, fired again, saw splinters explode from the wagon's side, but no blood. "Fall back," Josiah's voice carried from across the camp. "Mission accomplished. Extract." He was right. They'd killed perhaps 8 more men, wounded others, destroyed supplies, shattered confidence. Staying longer would just get them killed to no additional benefit. Mara fired 3 more rounds to cover Josiah's withdrawal, then ran. Behind her, Brennan's voice carried across the chaos. "After them! Don't let them escape! I want them dead! You hear me? Dead!" But his men were scattered, disorganized, more concerned with putting out fires and helping wounded than pursuing phantoms into desert darkness. A few shots cracked after Mara as she ran, but they were wild, desperate, the kind of shooting that wastes ammunition without hitting targets. She reached the rendezvous point, the old wash carved by seasonal floods, and dropped into cover, gasping for breath, adrenaline singing through her veins. 30 seconds later, Josiah appeared, materializing from darkness like he'd never left. "Clean extraction," he reported, breathing hard. "I count 9 confirmed dead in the camp, maybe 6 wounded. Supplies destroyed. Morale shattered. Brennan's still alive. I had a shot and missed. Can't win them all. Besides, killing the leader sometimes rallies troops. Leaving him alive to explain this disaster to his employers might serve us better." Mara considered that, nodded. "How are you on ammunition?" "Down to maybe 15 rounds. You?" "About the same. We need to get back to the house, resupply." She checked the stars, calculating time and distance. "We'll circle wide, come in from the northwest where they won't expect approach." They moved through darkness, exhausted but exhilarated, knowing they'd fundamentally changed the siege dynamic. Behind them, fires still burned in the enemy camp, and men still shouted confused orders to each other. The math had changed. Brennan had started this day with 22 men. Now he had perhaps 12 still combat effective, and those 12 had just learned that darkness belonged to the defenders. That night brought death from unexpected quarters. Mara and Josiah reached the ranch house just as false dawn began graying the eastern horizon. Ramon met them at the door, rifle ready, then lowered it with visible relief. "Thank the stars. We heard the shooting, saw the fires, thought you might be dead." "Not dead, just busy teaching Brennan's men to fear the night." Mara stepped inside, accepted water from Calder, drank deep. "Status here?" "Quiet." They pulled their perimeter in after the attack started, clustered together for mutual protection. "Been no movement toward the house since about 2 hours past midnight." Calder was smiling, rare expression that showed genuine pride. "You two scared them properly. I could hear the panic in their voices even from here." "Good. Fear makes men stupid. Stupid men make mistakes." Mara set down the canteen, felt the exhaustion trying to claim her now that the adrenaline was fading. "We've got maybe 2 hours before sunrise. Everyone get what rest you can. When dawn comes, Brennan's going to have choices to make about whether this contract is still worth the casualties." She moved to the window, looked out at the besiegers' camp where fires were finally being extinguished, where wounded were being tended and dead were being counted. Somewhere in that chaos, Tate Brennan was realizing that easy victory had become impossible, that the widow he'd thought to crush had instead crushed his forces. The question now was whether he'd cut his losses or double down on violence. Mara suspected she already knew the answer. Men like Brennan didn't surrender. They escalated. They brought more force, more weapons, more brutality, until resistance was finally broken, which meant the real battle was still coming. But now the enemy was wounded, frightened, unsure. Now they knew that the defenders weren't victims waiting for slaughter, but predators who'd learned to hunt in darkness. The mathematics of power had shifted, and Mara Kincaid was just getting started. Dawn broke over a battlefield transformed by darkness and blood. Mara stood at the window, watching the enemy camp stir to reluctant life as sunlight exposed the full damage of the night raid. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, covered now with blankets or canvas, silent testimony to the cost of underestimating cornered prey. The supply cache was a blackened ruin, still smoking in the early morning heat. Men moved with the uncertain shuffle of soldiers who'd learned that sleep brought death, who discovered that superior numbers meant nothing against enemies willing to become shadows. "They're breaking camp," Calder observed from his position, the Sharp's rifle resting across his knees. He'd managed maybe an hour of sleep, looked it, but his eyes were sharp as he tracked movement through the enemy lines. "Packing what's left of their supplies. Looks like they're preparing to move." "Retreat or reposition?" Josiah asked, joining them at the window with coffee brewed from their dwindling supplies. Bitter, weak stuff that barely qualified as coffee, but the warmth was something. "That's the question." Mara accepted a tin cup from him, grateful for the gesture even if the liquid inside was more insult than refreshment. "Brennan's too proud to retreat completely, but he's lost, 15 men now? Maybe 16? Even mercenary companies have limits to acceptable casualties." "I count 10 bodies visible in their camp," Ramon said, lowering the field glasses. "Plus the ones from yesterday's assault we can see scattered between here and there. That's not counting wounded who might die later or be too injured to fight." The mathematics were brutal but necessary. Every casualty on Brennan's side improved the defenders' odds, narrowed the gap between overwhelming force and desperate resistance. But math alone wouldn't determine this fight's outcome. Will mattered more than numbers, and Mara could see that Brennan's hired guns were questioning whether any amount of money justified dying for someone else's land grab. Movement at the enemy camp drew her attention. Tate Brennan himself emerged from his tent, and even at this distance, Mara could see the fury in his movements, sharp gestures, aggressive posture, the body language of a man who'd been humiliated and was looking for someone to punish for it. He was shouting at his men, pointing toward the ranch house, clearly arguing for continued assault, despite the night's losses. Some of the hired guns were nodding, weapons in hand, ready to follow orders, but others stood apart, shaking their heads, having quiet conversations that looked like men calculating whether their contracts had escape clauses for situations this deadly. "He's losing them," Josiah said quietly, watching the same dynamics. "Half his force is ready to quit. They signed up for easy money enforcing evictions, not a war against people who fight back. The other half still looks committed. Mara studied the group around Brennan, harder men, professionals who'd survived enough violence to respect it, but not fear it. Those are the dangerous ones, the ones who'll see this through to the end because their reputation depends on finishing contracts regardless of cost. How many in that group? 6? 7? 7 that I can identify as definitely staying. Maybe 8. She lowered the field glasses, mind already working through scenarios. If the rest desert, that brings Brennan down to manageable numbers. 8 against 4 isn't good odds, but it's survivable if we're smart. Assuming they don't get reinforcements, Calder pointed out, the syndicate has deep pockets. If Brennan sends for more guns, then we're dead, Mara finished bluntly. Which is why we need to end this today. Before he can wire for help, before more mercenaries arrive, before this becomes a siege we can't possibly win. The words hung heavy in the morning air. They all knew what she was proposing. One final push, one desperate gamble to break the remaining attackers before weight of numbers and resources could be brought to bear. It meant abandoning the defensive position that had served them so well, meant taking the fight to enemies who still held numerical advantage. It meant accepting that some or all of them would probably die in the next few hours. You're talking about attacking them, Ramon said, not quite a question. Going out there in daylight and forcing a final confrontation. I'm talking about ending this before they regroup, resupply, and come back stronger. Mara set down her coffee cup, turned to face her 3 defenders. We've hurt them badly, killed their confidence along with their men, but hurt isn't the same as broken, and Brennan won't stay hurt for long. He'll adapt, adjust tactics, bring in professionals who won't panic at night raids. So we hit them now, Josiah said slowly, working through the tactical implications. While they're still disorganized, while morale is shattered, before they can dig in or withdraw to regroup. Exactly. We've got maybe a 2-hour window while they're still deciding whether to stay or go. We use that window to make the decision for them, in the worst possible way. Calder was shaking his head, but not in disagreement, more like reluctant acceptance of necessity. You're proposing suicide tactics. We leave this house, we give up our defensive advantage. They'll cut us down in the open. Maybe. Or maybe we use the one advantage we still have. They don't expect it. They think we're trapped, desperate, waiting for them to make the next move. Mara moved to the table, started sketching a rough tactical plan. We hit them from multiple angles, create the impression of more attackers than we actually have. Target their horses first, strand them, take away their mobility. Then we work through whoever's left standing until either they break or we do. And if we break? Ramon asked quietly. Then we die knowing we made them pay for every inch of this land. Die knowing we didn't surrender, didn't betray everything our families built here. She looked up at him, her smoke-gray eyes hard as winter stone. Is that enough for you? Because if it isn't, if you want to take your chances surrendering, I'll understand. No judgment. You've already fought braver than anyone had right to expect. Ramon's jaw tightened. I'm not surrendering to the bastards who destroyed my grandfather. If we're doing this, I'm in. Calder? The old foreman studied his Sharps rifle, ran a weathered hand along its stock. I've had 63 years, most of them good, some of them great. If this is where the trail ends, at least it ends fighting for something that matters. I'm in. Josiah? I've been running from bad decisions and worse choices my whole life. Maybe it's time to stand still and face the consequences of one good choice. He checked his rifle's action, his scarred face thoughtful. Besides, I'm curious to see if we can actually pull this off. Be something to tell stories about if we survive. Mara felt something tighten in her chest, gratitude mixed with sorrow, pride mixed with the terrible knowledge that she was leading these men toward probable death. But they'd chosen this path freely, had stayed when leaving was possible, had committed to the stand that would define them. Then here's how we do it, she said, returning her attention to the sketch. Calder, you stay here with the Sharps, long-range support, targeting anyone who tries to organize defense or rally troops. You're our anchor point, the fixed position that makes them think we're still defending the house. While the rest of you circle and attack from unexpected angles, Calder finished. Classic hammer and anvil. I'm the anvil, you 3 are the hammer. Right, Josiah. You take the northern approach, work your way to their horse corral, scatter the horses, set them running, take away their ability to pursue or escape. then shift south and provide supporting fire for the main assault. Ramon and you hitting from the east and west? Ramon from the west, creating crossfire. I'm going straight up the middle, right into Brennan's position. She saw the protests forming and cut them off. It has to be me. Brennan knows my face, knows my voice. When he sees me coming for him personally, he'll focus on me instead of coordinating defense. His anger will make him stupid. His anger will make him kill you, Calder said flatly. Maybe. Or maybe I'll kill him first, and without their leader, the rest will scatter. Mara straightened, decision made, plan set. We move in 30 minutes. That gives everyone time to prepare, to write any final letters if needed, to make peace with what we're about to do. They disperse to their tasks, checking weapons, loading spare ammunition into pockets and pouches, wrapping wounds that had been ignored in the chaos of combat. Mara used the time to walk through the house one last time, touching walls her grandfather had built, running her fingers over furniture her mother had cherished, standing in the doorway where James had kissed her goodbye on the morning he'd ridden out and never returned. This house held ghosts now, 3 generations of Kincaids who'd lived and loved and died in service to the land that sustained them. If she died today, she'd join them in the small plot behind the house, become part of the earth she'd defended. There were worse fates. She found the letters she'd written the previous night, addressed to distant relatives, to territorial officials who might care about justice, to anyone who'd listened to the story of how the Garrison Development Syndicate had murdered lawful property owners who refused to surrender to corruption. She placed them carefully on the table where they'd be found, weighted down with her mother's silver locket. Then she loaded her grandfather's Colt Walker, checked her Winchester, filled her pockets with ammunition until she could barely move for the weight. If this was her last day, she'd die with empty guns and a clear conscience. The 30 minutes passed like 30 seconds. Then they were gathering at the back door, 4 people about to attempt something that would be remembered as either extraordinary courage or spectacular stupidity, depending on whether they survived to tell the story. Remember, Mara said quietly, looking at each of them in turn. We're not trying to kill everyone. We're trying to break their will, make continued resistance more costly than retreat, create chaos, exploit fear, and if you get the chance to wound rather than kill, take it. Wounded men slow down their companions, drain morale faster than corpses. Unless it's Brennan, Josiah said. Him we kill on sight. Him we kill with prejudice and malice aforethought, Mara agreed. Ready? They nodded, faces set with the grim determination of people who'd accepted death as a possible outcome but refused to accept defeat. Mara opened the door, and they moved out into the morning sun. The desert stretched before them, familiar ground that had witnessed generations of struggle, that had absorbed the blood of Kincaids and their enemies alike, that would judge this final battle with the indifference of stone and sand. They separated quickly, each moving to their assigned approach, using terrain and brush for concealment. Mara worked her way east, circling wide before turning back toward the enemy camp, using a dry wash for cover. Her heart hammered steady in her chest, not from fear but from anticipation. This was it, the moment all the preparation and waiting had built toward. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see the enemy camp clearly now. Maybe 11 men still present, the deserters having apparently left during the night or early morning. Brennan stood near his tent, gesturing angrily at a group of his remaining hired guns, clearly pushing for immediate assault on the ranch house. He had no idea that the assault was coming to him. Mara settled into position 50 yards from the camp perimeter, Winchester braced against a rock, waiting for the signal that would begin the final engagement. She didn't have to wait long. Calder's sharps boomed from the ranch house, deep, authoritative sound that carried across the desert morning. A hired gun standing near the horse corral jerked backward, chest exploding in crimson, dead before he hit the ground. The camp erupted into motion, men diving for cover, grabbing weapons, shouting confused questions about where the shot had come from. Then Josiah's rifle cracked from the north, and horses began screaming as bullets cut through their corral ropes. The animals stampeded, panicked by gunfire and sudden freedom, trampling through the camp and scattering supplies in their desperate flight. Chaos. Beautiful, terrible chaos. Mara stood up and started walking toward Brennan's position, Winchester at her shoulder, firing methodically. She dropped a man fumbling with his rifle, wounded another diving for cover, sent a third sprawling with a shot that shattered his knee and left him screaming. "Brennan!" Her voice carried across the chaos like a blade. "You wanted this land so badly. Here I am. Come take it from me." She saw him turn, saw recognition and rage transform his face. He raised his pistol, fired 3 shots that cracked past her head close enough to feel the displacement. Mara didn't flinch, just kept walking, kept firing, advancing like death itself had taken female form and come calling. Her Winchester ran dry. She dropped it, pulled her grandfather's Colt Walker, and kept coming. The massive revolver bucked in her hand, spitting fire and lead. A hired gun trying to flank her position took the round in his shoulder, spun away screaming. Another caught the second bullet in his gut, folded over like he'd been kicked by a mule. Brennan was shouting orders that nobody was following, his men too busy trying to survive Ramon's fire from the west, Josiah's from the north, Calder's precise shots from the ranch house that picked off anyone who tried to organize defense. The professional mercenaries were breaking, abandoning positions, running for their lives because this contract had become a death sentence and no amount of money was worth dying for someone else's greed. But Brennan wasn't running. He stood his ground, emptying his pistol toward Mara, reloading with fumbling hands, firing again. His face was a mask of fury and frustration. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. This wasn't the script he'd been following. Mara felt something tug at her sleeve as a bullet passed through fabric, felt another impact against the ammunition pouch at her belt, the slug stopped by brass cartridges that saved her life. She fired the Colt Walker again, saw Brennan dive behind a wagon as the massive bullet splintered wood where his head had been a second before. Around her, the battle was dissolving into rout. Hired guns were fleeing on foot, abandoning weapons and wounded alike in their desperation to escape. The few who'd tried to hold position were down, dead or wounded or simply cowering behind cover, unwilling to die for a lost cause. Only Brennan remained, trapped behind his wagon, firing occasionally, but mostly just shouting threats and curses into the morning air. Mara approached carefully, reloading the Colt Walker as she moved. 20 feet from the wagon. 15. 10. "It's over, Brennan," she called. "Your men are gone. Your supplies are destroyed. You've lost." "Not while I'm still breathing," his voice cracked with rage. "The Syndicate will send more men. Better men. They'll burn your house to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. Then they'll do it without you." She came around the wagon fast, Colt Walker raised, finger already tightening on the trigger. But Brennan wasn't where she'd expected. He'd circled the other direction, was behind her, pistol rising toward her exposed back. The shot that rang out didn't come from his gun. Brennan jerked forward, a flower of blood blooming between his shoulder blades. He turned, confused, looking for the shooter who'd killed him. Josiah stepped from behind a pile of supplies, rifle smoking, his face expressionless. Brennan tried to raise his pistol, tried to speak, tried to do anything other than die. Failed at all 3. He collapsed face first into the dirt, twitched once, then lay still. The sudden silence was absolute. Mara stood frozen, Colt Walker still raised, processing how close she'd come to death, how Josiah's shot had arrived exactly when needed. Around her, the camp was a ruin, bodies scattered, supplies destroyed, horses gone, the remnants of Brennan's force visible as distant figures fleeing across the desert. "You all right?" Josiah asked, approaching cautiously. "Fine. You?" "Intact." He looked down at Brennan's body without emotion. "Had to be done. He was going to kill you." "I know." Mara lowered the Colt Walker, suddenly aware of how heavy it was, how exhausted she was, how close this entire gamble had come to catastrophic failure. "Thank you. Thank me when we're sure it's over." Ramon emerged from the western approach, limping slightly but alive, his young face showing the shell-shocked expression of someone who'd survived violence they hadn't been certain they'd lived through. Behind him, Calder was making his way from the ranch house, moving slow but steady, the Sharp's rifle slung across his back. They gathered near Brennan's body, 4 people who'd just won a battle that should have killed them, standing amid the wreckage of an assault that had failed through determination and desperate tactics and sheer refusal to accept defeat. "We did it," Ramon said, voice barely above a whisper. "We actually did it." "We survived it," Mara corrected. "Whether we did it depends on what comes next." "What does come next?" Calder asked, surveying the destroyed camp. The syndicate won't just accept this loss. They'll investigate, they'll file legal complaints, they'll find out what happens when they murder lawful property owners and try to steal land through corruption, Mara interrupted. We've got witnesses now. The hired guns who fled will talk, will testify about Brennan's orders, about the assault on a legitimate ranch. We've got evidence, bodies, weapons, documents in Brennan's tent that probably detail the syndicate's entire operation. She moved to the tent, pushed aside the flap, and found exactly what she'd hoped for. A portable desk scattered with papers, maps showing properties the syndicate had targeted, correspondence detailing payments to sheriffs and judges, the whole corrupt network laid bare in documents Brennan had been too arrogant to destroy. This is it, she breathed, gathering the papers carefully. This is everything we need to expose them. Names, dates, amounts paid, judges bribed, properties stolen. The territorial capital will have to investigate when we present this evidence. If we survive long enough to present it, Josiah pointed out, the syndicate might send someone to silence us before we can testify. Then we make copies, send them to newspapers, to the territorial marshal, to anyone who'll listen. Mara clutched the documents like they were precious as gold. And in a sense, they were. Evidence of corruption was the only currency that mattered now. We make this public enough that killing us becomes pointless. The story survives even if we don't. They spent the next hour securing the camp, counting bodies, 7 dead in the final assault, plus the ones from previous engagements, bringing Brennan's total casualties to somewhere around 20 men killed or wounded, badly enough to be out of the fight. It was a staggering loss for what should have been a simple eviction enforcement. It was a monument to the cost of underestimating people defending their homes. Among the dead, Mara found young men barely older than Ramon, professionals who'd sold their skills to the highest bidder, drifters looking for easy money who'd instead found hard deaths. She felt no satisfaction in their corpses, just weary acceptance that violence had been necessary, that killing had been the only language the syndicate understood. They dragged the bodies into a line, covered them with blankets, not from respect, but from simple human decency that persisted even in the aftermath of slaughter. "What about Brennan?" Ramon asked, looking at the syndicate enforcer's corpse. "We bury him separate, mark the grave. When the territorial marshal investigates, we want evidence preserved, not rotting in the desert." Mara straightened, bones aching, exhaustion finally catching up now that adrenaline was fading. "Calder, you and Ramon handle the burials. Josiah and I will search the camp thoroughly, gather every scrap of evidence." They worked through the afternoon, methodical despite their fatigue, understanding that thoroughness now could mean the difference between justice and revenge later. Mara found ledgers detailing the syndicate's land acquisitions, found contracts with hired guns, found correspondence with territorial officials that made her blood boil with rage at the depth of corruption. The Garrison Development Syndicate hadn't just targeted her ranch. They'd systematically destroyed dozens of small property owners across 3 territories, had bribed officials, had murdered obstacles, had built an empire on theft and violence and the exploitation of frontier justice's weaknesses. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that everyone had a breaking point, that everyone could be frightened or bought or killed into submission. They hadn't counted on Mara Kincaid, who'd inherited her grandfather's stubbornness and her father's courage and her husband's principles, who decided that some things mattered more than survival. As the sun began its descent toward evening, they gathered back at the ranch house, dirty, wounded, exhausted, but alive. The siege was broken. The attackers were defeated or scattered. The evidence of syndicate corruption was documented and secured. They'd won. But victory felt less like triumph and more like exhausted relief, the kind that came after surviving something that should have killed you. "What now?" Calder asked, collapsing into a chair with a groan. "We've got the evidence, we've got the bodies, we've got our testimony, but the syndicate's lawyers are better than territorial justice. They'll find ways to bury this, to make it disappear. Not if we make it impossible to ignore." Mara spread the captured documents across the table. "We send copies to every newspaper in the territory. We wire the territorial marshal with preliminary evidence. We make so much noise that silence becomes impossible. And then? Then we wait. We defend this land until justice arrives, or until the syndicate sends someone else to finish what Brennan started." She looked around at her 3 companions. beaten, bloodied, but unbroken. We've bought time, maybe weeks, maybe months. We use that time to fortify, to prepare, to make sure that if they come again, the cost is even higher. Ramon was staring out the window at the desert where bodies lay beneath blankets, where the spring still flowed clear and cold despite all the blood that had been spilled for it. Was it worth it? He asked quietly. All these dead men, all this violence, just for land and water? Not just land, Mara said softly. Principle. The principle that theft shouldn't be rewarded, that corruption shouldn't win, that power should have limits. She moved to stand beside him, looking out at the same view. Your grandfather lost his ranch because he couldn't fight the syndicate alone. My husband died because he tried to resist and failed. All these men died because the syndicate thought violence was the answer to defiance. And we taught them different. We taught them that some people fight back, that some people would rather die than surrender what's theirs. That power isn't unlimited, and greed has a price. She put a hand on his shoulder. Whether that lesson sticks depends on what we do next, on whether we follow through, whether we push for justice, whether we make sure their deaths meant something beyond our survival. The evening settled across the desert like a blessing, cooling air bringing relief from the day's heat and violence. They ate sparingly from their remaining supplies, drank water from the spring they'd defended at such terrible cost, tended wounds and checked weapons, and tried to process the enormity of what they'd survived. Later, as stars emerged overhead and the desert returned to its ancient silence, Mara stood on the porch one last time, looking out at land that was still hers, still free of the syndicate's control. She'd paid for it in blood and fear and desperate gambles that could have ended in slaughter, but it was still hers, and tomorrow she'd begin the work of making sure it stayed that way, not through more violence, but through testimony and evidence and the slow grinding wheels of justice that sometimes, rarely, actually turned in favor of the powerless. Behind her, the house stood solid, walls scarred by bullets but still standing, still sheltering the defenders who'd refused to break. Ahead of her, the spring flowed eternal, water bubbling up from depths that predated empires and would outlast them, indifferent to human conflict but sustaining human life nonetheless. This was what she'd fought for. This was what she'd killed for. And though the ghosts of dead men would haunt her dreams for years to come, though the weight of all that violence would settle into her bones like desert dust, she couldn't bring herself to regret the choices that had led here. Some battles were worth fighting. Some stands were worth making. Some prices were worth paying. The desert wind picked up, carrying away the last echoes of gunfire, erasing the traces of conflict as it had erased countless conflicts before. But the land remained. The water remained. And Mara Kincaid remained, bloodied but unbroken, victorious but not triumphant, alive and determined to make that survival count for something beyond mere existence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new battles in courtrooms instead of deserts. But tonight, she was simply alive. And that was enough. The dawn after victory brought no celebration, only the grim work of survival's aftermath. Mara woke before sunrise, her body protesting every movement, muscles screaming from 2 days of combat, and a night of restless sleep haunted by the faces of men she'd killed. She dressed in silence, moving through the house where Calder snored softly in his corner, and Ramon lay curled near the door, rifle still clutched in sleep. Josiah was already awake, standing watch at the window, coffee cup in hand. "Anything?" she asked quietly. "Nothing. Desert's empty except for buzzards circling the burial sites." He glanced at her, his scarred face thoughtful. "You think they'll come back? The syndicate?" "Eventually, but not today, not this week." Mara joined him at the window, accepted the coffee he offered. "They'll need time to process what happened here, to explain to their investors why 20 men couldn't evict one widow. That buys us a window to act." "How long a window?" 2 weeks? Maybe 3 if we're lucky." She sipped the bitter coffee, grateful for its heat, if not its taste. "Long enough to get the evidence to people who matter. Long enough to make this story too public to bury." They'd spent the previous evening carefully organizing Brennan's documents, dividing them into multiple sets, creating redundancy in case one set was destroyed or stolen. Ledgers showing bribes paid to territorial judges. Correspondence detailing coordinated foreclosures and fraudulent land claims. Contracts with hired guns that explicitly authorized violence against property owners who resisted eviction. It was damning evidence of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. It was also a death sentence for anyone who tried to expose it. "I'll ride to Copper Valley today," Josiah said, reading her thoughts. "Take one set of documents to the territorial marshal's office. Make sure they're officially filed before the syndicate can interfere. That's a 3-day ride. 4 if you're careful." "I'll be careful." Set down his coffee cup. "But someone needs to do it, and I'm the most expendable. Ramon's too young, Calder's too old, and you're the witness they'll need when this goes to trial." Mara wanted to argue, wanted to say that none of them were expendable, that they'd survive together and should see this through together. But tactical reality overrode sentiment. Josiah was right. Someone had to carry the evidence to official channels, and he was the best choice. "Take the fastest horse we've got left. Take extra ammunition and enough supplies for a week in case you need to hide or take a longer route." She turned to face him directly. "And Josiah, if they catch you, if the syndicate intercepts you before you reach the marshal, don't try to fight. Just destroy the documents and run. We've got backup copies. Your life matters more than paper." "My life matters less than making sure justice happens." He smiled slightly. "But I'll try to stay alive anyway." Still curious how this story ends. They prepared his departure carefully, selecting documents, wrapping them in oilcloth for protection, distributing ammunition and supplies. By the time the sun cleared the eastern horizon, Josiah was mounted and ready, looking back at the ranch house one last time. "Keep them safe," he said to Mara. "I'll be back in a week, 2 at most." "We'll be here, same as always." She stepped close to his horse, looked up at him. "Thank you for everything. For staying when you could have run, for fighting when most men would have surrendered. Thank your husband. He's the one who gave me the chance to be something better than what I was." Josiah touched his hat brim in farewell, then spurred his horse and rode northeast toward Copper Valley and whatever justice the territorial system might provide. Mara watched him go until he disappeared into the desert shimmer, then turned back to the house where her remaining defenders waited. The next 2 weeks became an exercise in vigilant patience. They fortified the ranch further, using materials salvaged from Brennan's destroyed camp to reinforce walls and improve defensive positions. They rationed their limited supplies, hunted sparingly for game, maintained constant watch on the horizon for signs of new threats. And they waited. Ramon proved himself increasingly valuable during this period, not just as a fighter, but as someone who could think strategically about long-term survival. He suggested improvements to their water collection, found ways to stretch their food supplies, even began teaching himself basic carpentry to repair damage the house had sustained during the siege. "My grandfather used to say that surviving wasn't enough," he told Mara one evening as they worked together to patch bullet holes in the adobe walls. "He said you had to survive with purpose, with plans for tomorrow, or you were just delaying the inevitable." Smart man, your grandfather. Smart enough to know when he was beaten, just not stubborn enough to keep fighting when fighting seemed impossible. Ramon smoothed wet adobe into a gap, his young face serious. "I used to resent him for that, for giving up, for letting the syndicate take everything without a real fight. But now, after seeing what fighting actually costs, I understand better. It's not cowardice to choose survival over principle when you've got a family depending on you. But sometimes principle is what makes survival meaningful," Mara countered gently. "Your grandfather made the choice he thought was right for his family. I made a different choice. Neither of us is wrong. We just valued different things. And which choice will history remember? Whichever one we're alive to tell stories about." She stepped back, examining their repair work. "That's why Josiah's mission matters so much. If we die here without the story getting out, we're just another forgotten conflict in a territory that's seen thousands. But if the evidence reaches the right people, if justice actually happens, then every person the syndicate crushed before us gets vindication too." Ramon was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Do you really believe justice will happen? That territorial courts will prosecute wealthy men with political connections?" "I believe justice is possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible if we fight for it hard enough." Mara set down her tools, wiping adobe dust from her hands. The syndicate's weakness is its scale. They've hurt too many people across too many territories. All those victims, if they come forward, if they testify, if they demand investigation, even corrupt officials will have to respond. There's a limit to how much theft and murder can be ignored before it becomes politically impossible to protect the thieves. You're betting our lives on political pressure? I'm betting our lives on the hope that enough good people still exist in positions of power to care about corruption when it's exposed. Maybe that's naive. Maybe it's foolish. But it's better than assuming the fight is already lost. They continued working as afternoon faded toward evening, making the ranch incrementally stronger, preparing for threats that might never materialize or might arrive tomorrow with overwhelming force. The uncertainty was exhausting, but it was also galvanizing. Every hour they survived was another hour for Josiah to reach Copper Valley, another hour for justice to become possible. On the 8th day after Josiah's departure, riders appeared on the eastern horizon. Mara's heart seized when she saw them, immediately calculating numbers and threat level. 4 riders, approaching at steady pace rather than aggressive charge, showing no obvious weapons. "Could be the syndicate," Calder said from his position, the sharps already trained on the approaching group. "Could be law. Could be just travelers who don't know better than to approach a ranch that just fought off a siege. Or it could be Josiah with company." Mara raised the field glasses, studying the riders as they grew closer. "I don't recognize—" "Wait, the lead rider? That's not syndicate. That's territorial marshal insignia." Relief and anxiety warred in her chest. If the marshal had come personally, it meant Josiah had succeeded in filing the evidence. But it also meant official scrutiny, questions about the deaths, potential legal consequences for the defenders who'd killed in what they claimed was self-defense. The riders stopped at respectful distance, and the lead man dismounted. Tall figure in his 50s, weathered and competent-looking, wearing the silver star of a territorial marshal. "Mrs. Mara Kincaid?" His voice carried authority without aggression. "I'm Mara Kincaid. State your business, Marshal." "Marshal Thomas Blackwood, territorial authority for this district and 3 others. I'm here regarding documents filed in Copper Valley by a Mr. Josiah Trent, documents alleging systematic fraud and violence by the Garrison Development Syndicate." He gestured to his companions. "I've brought a deputy marshal and 2 territorial investigators to examine the evidence and take statements." Josiah made it through then. The relief was overwhelming. Made it through, filed formal complaints, and testified before a territorial judge about what happened here. Based on his testimony and the documents he provided, we've opened formal investigation into the syndicate's activities across multiple territories. Blackwood looked past her at the ranch house, at the visible damage from the siege. "May we approach? I'd like to see the battlefield, examine the physical evidence, take your statement about what transpired." Mara lowered her rifle slightly. "You're welcome to approach, Marshal, but understand that if this is syndicate deception, if you're here to finish what Brennan started, you'll die on this land, just like he did. No deception, Mrs. Kincaid. I'm here representing territorial law, real law, not the corrupted version the syndicate has been purchasing." He remounted, rode forward slowly with his companions. "Though I appreciate your caution, based on what I've read in those documents, you've got every reason to distrust official authority." They came into the ranch yard, and Mara could see them taking in the details. Bullet-scarred walls, hastily repaired damage, the defensive positions that spoke of desperate resistance. Blackwood dismounted again, his experienced eyes missing nothing. "How many did you face?" he asked. 22 initially. Maybe more during the siege." Mara gestured toward the burial sites. "We killed 17, wounded others badly enough they fled. The bodies are marked and preserved as you requested in your wire to Josiah." "You preserved evidence?" Blackwood looked surprised. "I'm not stupid, Marshal. I knew this would end up in court eventually, either territorial court trying us for murder or us prosecuting the syndicate for attempted theft and actual murder of my husband. Evidence matters in both scenarios." Smart thinking. He turned to his deputies. "Taylor, you and Mason start documenting the graves, verify identities where possible, collect weapons and personal effects. I want everything recorded properly for trial evidence." As the investigators dispersed to their work, Blackwood turned back to Mara. "I need your full statement, Mrs. Kincaid. Everything that happened, starting from when the syndicate first approached you about selling. Don't leave out details, even ones that might seem incriminating. I need the complete truth to build a case that will actually hold up." They spent the next 3 hours going through everything. James's suspicious death, the escalating pressure from syndicate representatives, Brennan's arrival with armed force, the siege, and subsequent battles. Mara spoke carefully but honestly, acknowledging the men she'd killed, the tactics they'd used, the desperate calculation that had led to their final assault on Brennan's camp. Blackwood listened without interruption, taking notes in a worn leather journal, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just letting her tell the story in her own words. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, reviewing his notes. "This is going to be complicated," he said finally. "On one hand, you've got clear evidence of self-defense, armed men attacking your property, attempting to seize land through force after you refused legitimate sale offers. On the other hand, you killed 17 people. Territorial law doesn't treat that lightly, even in self-defense situations. Are you arresting me, Marshal? No. But I am telling you that the syndicate's lawyers will push hard for murder charges. They'll argue that you could have surrendered, that you escalated violence unnecessarily, that you set traps and conducted offensive operations that go beyond simple self-defense." He closed his journal. "You need to be prepared for legal battles that might be harder than the physical ones you just survived. I've got evidence of their corruption. Brennan's documents are helpful but not decisive. Yes, they show systematic fraud by the syndicate. Yes, they'll lead to investigations and probably prosecutions. But they don't directly prove that you were justified in killing 17 men rather than accepting legal resolution through courts." Blackwood's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "I believe you were justified. I think any reasonable person would have done the same in your position. But the law isn't always reasonable, and the syndicate has resources to hire lawyers who'll twist the law to their advantage." Mara felt the weight of his words settling like stone in her chest. They'd survived the siege only to face a different kind of battle. One fought in courtrooms with words instead of bullets, but potentially just as deadly in terms of consequences. "What do you recommend?" she asked quietly. "Build your defense carefully. Document everything. Witness statements from your men, physical evidence from the siege, copies of all correspondence with the syndicate showing you attempted peaceful resolution before resorting to violence." He paused. "And find yourself a good lawyer. The Territorial Court in Copper Valley has a few honest attorneys who aren't on the syndicate's payroll. You'll need one of them." Over the next 2 days, Marshal Blackwood and his team conducted thorough investigation, documenting grave sites, collecting weapons, interviewing Calder and Ramon about the siege, examining Brennan's captured documents in detail. They worked with professional efficiency, treating the ranch as a crime scene that required proper preservation. On the third day, Josiah returned from Copper Valley, riding alongside a distinguished-looking man in expensive but travel-worn clothes. "Mrs. Kincaid," Josiah called as they approached. "I've brought someone you need to meet. This is Daniel Ashford, attorney from Copper Valley. He's agreed to represent you in the legal proceedings." Ashford dismounted with the careful movements of someone more accustomed to courtrooms than saddles. He was perhaps 50, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades fighting legal battles. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, extending his hand. "Mr. Trent has briefed me on your situation. I've also reviewed the documents he filed with the Marshal's office. If you're willing, I'd like to take your case." "What makes you think you can win?" Mara asked bluntly. "Because the law, when applied honestly rather than corruptly, is actually on your side. You have documented evidence of prior violence by the syndicate. You have witnesses to their armed assault on your property. You have physical evidence of sustained siege and defensive resistance." Ashford pulled a document from his satchel. "And I've already filed preliminary motions with the Territorial Court requesting investigation of the judges who approved the syndicate's fraudulent land claims. If we can prove systematic corruption, it undermines their entire legal position." "That sounds optimistic." "I'm not optimistic, Mrs. Kincaid. I'm thorough. I've built a career on taking cases that other attorneys consider unwinnable and finding the weaknesses in my opponent's positions." He smiled slightly. "The syndicate's weakness is that they've been too successful, too greedy. They've crushed so many people that victims are emerging from across multiple territories, all willing to testify about similar patterns of fraud and violence. Your case isn't isolated. It's the most dramatic example of a systematic criminal enterprise. And if we lose, then you'll likely face prison time for manslaughter or murder, depending on how vindictive the prosecution wants to be. Your property will be seized to cover legal judgments, and the syndicate will continue crushing other small landowners across the territories." Ashford's expression turned serious. But if we win, we set precedent that property rights actually mean something, that violence in self-defense is legally protected, and that wealthy corporations can't simply purchase the law to serve their interests. Mara studied the attorney, looking for signs of deception or false confidence. She found neither, just professional competence and what appeared to be genuine commitment to the principle of justice. "What do you charge for representation?" she asked. "For this case? Nothing up front. If we win, you pay me 10% of any financial settlement or judgment. If we lose, you owe me nothing because you'll have nothing left to pay with." Ashford tucked the document back into his satchel. "I'm not doing this entirely from altruism, Mrs. Kincaid. This case could make my reputation if we win. It's worth the gamble." "Then we have an agreement." Mara shook his hand. "When do we start?" "We already have. I've filed motions, requested investigations, and begun building a coalition of other syndicate victims who'll testify about similar patterns of behavior." He gestured toward the ranch house. "Now I need to document everything here. Take statements, photograph evidence, prepare the narrative we'll present in court." The following week brought a flurry of legal activity that made Mara's head spin. Ashford worked tirelessly, conducting interviews, organizing evidence, filing motions with the territorial court. Other victims of the syndicate began arriving: displaced ranchers, foreclosed business owners, widows whose husbands had died in suspicious accidents after refusing to sell their properties. Each testimony added weight to the case, transformed Mara's individual resistance into a larger story about systematic corruption and the limits of corporate power. Ramon listened to these testimonies with growing emotion, recognizing echoes of his own grandfather's experience in their stories. One evening, after an elderly rancher had finished describing how the syndicate had destroyed his family's homestead through fraudulent water rights claims, Ramon approached Mara with determined expression. "I want to testify," he said, "about what they did to my grandfather, about how they drove him to despair and early death. It's relevant evidence, isn't it? Pattern of behavior?" "It's relevant," Mara confirmed. "But it also means exposing yourself to scrutiny, to cross-examination by syndicate lawyers who will try to discredit you. Are you ready for that?" "I'm ready to make sure they pay for what they did. Not just to you, not just to me, but to everyone they crushed." Ramon's young face showed maturity that hadn't been there before the siege. "If telling my grandfather's story helps win this case, then it's worth whatever scrutiny comes with it." Mara felt pride swell in her chest. This boy who'd been uncertain and frightened during the siege had become a man willing to stand up for principle despite personal cost. "Then we'll add your testimony to the case," she said. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." 6 weeks after the siege ended, the territorial court in Copper Valley convened formal proceedings to examine the syndicate's activities and determine whether criminal charges should be filed. The courtroom was packed. Victims seeking justice, reporters documenting the scandal, syndicate representatives, and their expensive lawyers trying to contain the damage. Mara sat at the defendant's table with Ashford beside her, watching as the territorial judge, a stern woman named Margaret Holloway, who'd built a reputation for incorruptibility, reviewed the mountains of evidence that had been presented. The syndicate's lead attorney was a shark-faced man named Cornelius Hatch, who'd spent 3 days trying to discredit witness testimony and dismiss the captured documents as fabricated evidence. He was good at his job, Mara had to admit, twisting words, finding inconsistencies in testimony, making legitimate self-defense sound like murderous aggression. But Ashford was better. He methodically built the case piece by piece, showing the pattern of syndicate behavior across territories, demonstrating that Mara's experience wasn't isolated but representative. He presented the captured documents with expert testimony about their authenticity. He called character witnesses who testified about James Kincaid's integrity and the suspicious circumstances of his death. And when Hatch tried to paint Mara as a violent criminal who'd murdered 17 men, Ashford countered with testimony from Marshal Blackwood about the defensive positions, the evidence of siege, the fact that Mara had repeatedly tried to resolve the conflict peacefully before violence became unavoidable. The trial lasted 2 weeks. On the final day, Judge Holloway delivered her ruling with the firmness of someone who'd weighed evidence carefully and reached conclusions that would withstand scrutiny. This court finds that the Garrison Development Syndicate engaged in systematic fraud, corruption, and violence across multiple territories, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. The evidence presented demonstrates coordination between syndicate representatives and territorial officials to illegally seize properties through fraudulent claims, bribery, and intimidation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Holloway's gavel cracked down sharply. Regarding the specific case of Mara Kincaid and the deaths that occurred on her property, this court finds that Mrs. Kincaid acted in legitimate self-defense against armed assault. The siege conducted by Tate Brennan and his mercenary force constituted illegal violence that justified defensive response, including lethal force. Mara felt something release in her chest, tension she'd been carrying for weeks, fear that justice would fail, that she'd lose everything despite being right. Therefore, Holloway continued, this court dismisses all criminal charges against Mara Kincaid and her defenders. Furthermore, this court orders the dissolution of the Garrison Development Syndicate, seizure of its assets to provide restitution for victims of its fraudulent activities, and criminal prosecution of syndicate executives and officials who participated in the corruption. The gavel fell again, final and definitive. Victory. Not complete, not perfect, but real enough to matter. Outside the courthouse, Mara stood in afternoon sunlight surrounded by people she'd never met, other victims of the syndicate who'd found vindication through her resistance. They thanked her, shook her hand, told stories about families and properties and lives that had been destroyed but might now be rebuilt. Ashford appeared at her elbow, looking satisfied. Congratulations, Mrs. Kincaid. You've just reshaped property law in 3 territories. Every case like yours from now on will cite this precedent. How long before the syndicate appeals? Before their lawyers find ways to overturn the ruling? They'll try. But Judge Holloway is thorough. Her ruling is built on solid precedent and overwhelming evidence. Appeals are possible, but unlikely to succeed. He smiled. You've won, Mrs. Kincaid. Actually won. The land is yours, the legal threats are resolved, and you've got financial compensation coming once the syndicate's assets are liquidated. Mara should have felt triumph, should have felt joy. Instead, she felt exhausted relief mixed with lingering sorrow for all the death and destruction that had been necessary to reach this point. What about the men I killed? She asked quietly. Does the court's ruling bring them back? Does legal vindication undo their deaths? No, Ashford said honestly. But their deaths weren't meaningless. They died enforcing corruption, and their deaths helped expose that corruption to consequences. That's not redemption, but it's something. She nodded, accepting the complicated truth that victory came with permanent costs, that justice and peace weren't the same thing, that surviving meant learning to live with choices that couldn't be undone. The journey back to the ranch took 3 days. Mara rode alongside Josiah, Calder, and Ramon, 4 people who'd faced death together and emerged as something more than employer and employees. They were bonded now by shared violence and shared survival, by the knowledge that they'd stood for principle when surrender would have been easier. When the ranch house finally appeared on the horizon, Mara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Bullet-scarred walls, patched adobe, the springs still flowing clear and cold behind the property. Home. Not perfect, not peaceful, but hers, earned through blood and determination and refusal to accept that power always won. They settled back into ranch life slowly, repairing damage, restocking supplies, beginning the work of transforming a battlefield back into a working property. The financial compensation from the syndicate's liquidated assets arrived months later, enough to rebuild, to expand, to hire additional hands and transform the ranch into something prosperous. But Mara made one change that went beyond practical improvement. In the small plot behind the house where her family lay buried, she added new markers. Not for the men she'd killed, but for the principle they'd died defending. Simple stones that read, "Here stood those who refused to break, 1889. A reminder, a warning, a promise that this land would never again be taken by corruption or violence. Years passed. Ramon stayed on, eventually managing the ranch's expansion, marrying a woman from Copper Valley, and starting a family on land he'd helped defend. Calder worked until age and infirmity finally forced retirement, spending his final years in a comfortable room in the ranch house, telling stories about the siege to grandchildren who listened with wide eyes. Josiah drifted away eventually, as men with dark pasts always seem to do, but he left with handshake and mutual respect, carrying the knowledge that he'd found redemption in defending something that mattered. and Mara aged into the legend she'd created, the widow who'd faced down corporate power and won, who'd proven that principle could triumph over greed if someone was willing to pay its price. Other ranchers facing similar pressure would make pilgrimages to her property, seeking advice about how to resist foreclosure or challenge fraudulent claims. She'd welcome them, share her experience, provide contacts with attorneys who'd learned from Ashford's precedent. She became, without seeking it, a symbol of resistance against the kind of corruption that had killed her husband and nearly destroyed her land. On her 60th birthday, when age had finally begun slowing her down, she stood on the porch one evening watching sunset paint the desert in familiar colors. The spring still flowed. The land still sustained life. New families had settled on properties returned through the syndicate's dissolution, building the kind of community that frontier isolation had previously prevented. Her victory had rippled outward, creating change beyond her individual survival. That was worth something. Worth the nightmares that still occasionally woke her. Worth the scars, both visible and hidden. Worth the weight of 17 deaths that she'd carry until her own came. Was it worth it? Ramon's daughter asked from beside her, bright girl of perhaps 12, who'd heard the stories but couldn't quite grasp their reality. Mara considered the question honestly, looking out at land that had cost so much to keep. Yes, she said finally. Not because I wanted violence or sought conflict, but because some principles are worth defending and surrender teaches the wrong lesson. Your children, your grandchildren, they'll grow up knowing that people fought for this land, that property rights matter, that corruption has limits. Will they remember the people who died? Some will. Others will just inherit the freedom those deaths purchased without understanding its cost. Mara smiled slightly. That's how progress works. We fight battles so the next generation doesn't have to, even knowing they might not appreciate the fighting. The girl thought about that, then asked the question that revealed wisdom beyond her years. Would you do it again? Knowing what it would cost? Mara was quiet for a long moment, watching the desert transform in the dying light, remembering 2 days of siege and violence that had reshaped her life and the territory's legal landscape. I'd try to find a better way, she said honestly. I'd try harder to avoid violence, to build coalitions earlier, to expose the corruption before it required bloodshed to stop. She paused. But if avoiding violence meant surrendering principle, if peaceful resolution proved impossible, then yes, I'd do it again. Because some things matter more than safety, and teaching that lesson is worth the cost. The sunset faded into twilight, and Mara Kincaid remained where she'd always been, on land that was hers, watching over a legacy built on stubborn courage and the refusal to let power go unchallenged. Behind her, the ranch house stood solid against the gathering darkness, sheltering new generations who'd never know siege or violence, who'd inherit peace without understanding the price it had demanded. That was enough. That was victory. And when Mara Kincaid finally died many years later, surrounded by the extended family that had grown around the ranch she'd defended, her last act was to add one final provision to her will, a requirement that the land never be sold to corporate interests, never be surrendered to the kind of greed that had killed her husband and threatened to destroy her legacy. The ranch would pass through family lines. Each generation taught the story of how it had been defended, each inheritor understanding that they held something worth more than money. They held principle made tangible, resistance made permanent, the proof that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, the powerless could stand against power and win. The desert wind carried her memory long after her death, whispered her story across territories that had been transformed by her refusal to break, reminded each new generation that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to fight despite it. And in courtrooms across the expanding territories, in legal precedents that protected property rights and limited corporate power in the lives of families who'd reclaimed land stolen by the syndicate's dissolution, Mara Kincaid's legacy lived on. Not perfect, not without cost, but real, enduring, and ultimately triumphant. The quiet woman who'd smiled at men demanding her surrender had proven what those men learned too late, that silence wasn't weakness, that isolation wasn't vulnerability, that underestimating people defending their homes was a fatal miscalculation. She'd won not through superior force, but through superior will, not through violence, but through refusal to let violence define the outcome, not through vengeance, but through commitment to justice that outlasted individual conflict. And the land remained, as it always had, as it always would, indifferent to human struggle but sustaining human life, holding the blood and bones of those who'd fought for it, flowing with water that predated empires and would outlast them all. The Kincaid Spring still runs today, clear and cold and eternal, watering land that knows its own history, that remembers the price of freedom and the cost of principle. And somewhere in the desert silence, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of a quiet woman's voice telling powerful men the truth they'd traveled far to ignore. That some people don't break, some land can't be stolen, and some stands are worth making regardless of odds or outcomes. That was Mara Kincaid's lesson. That was her victory. That was her legacy, permanent, unbroken, and ultimately triumphant against forces that thought power was the same as right. The desert remembers, the land endures, and the story survives, passed down through generations, refined by time, but never forgetting the fundamental truth at its heart, that courage matters, principle matters, and sometimes one person's refusal to surrender can reshape the entire frontier.